This is Tammie with Empowered Beyond Belief, and it is my job to empower you. A Wanderer in the Spirit Lands by Franchezzo, transcribed by A. Farnese. Part 3. The Kingdom of Hell. Chapter 19. Through the Wall of Fire. The companion who was assigned to me in this expedition was a spirit who had been in this sphere before, and who was, therefore, well fitted to act as my guide on entering this land of horrors. After a short time, we were to separate, he told me, and each to follow his own path. But at any time, either of us could, if needful, summon the other to his aid in case of extremity. As we drew near the great bank of smoke and flame, I remarked to my companion upon the strangely material appearance they presented. I was accustomed, in the spirit world, to the realism and solidity of all our surroundings, which mortals are apt to imagine must be of some ethereal and intangible nature, since they are not visible to ordinary eyesight. Still, these thick clouds of smoke, these leaping tongues of flame, were contrary to what I had pictured hell as being like. I had seen dark and dreary countries and unhappy spirits in my wanderings, but I had seen no flames, no fire of any sort, and I had totally disbelieved in material flames in a palpable form, and had deemed the fires of hell to be merely a figure of speech to express a mental state. Many have taught that it is so, and that the torments of hell are mental and subjective, not objective at all. I said something of this to my companion, and he replied, "Both ideas are in a sense right. These flames and this smoke are created by the spiritual emanations of the unhappy beings who dwell within that fiery wall. And material as they seem to your eyes, open to the sight of spiritual things, they would be invisible to a mortal sight, could one still in the body of flesh by any miracle visit this spot. They have in fact no earthly material in them, yet they are nonetheless material in the sense that all things earthly or spiritual are clothed in a matter of some kind. The number and variety of degrees of solidity in matter are infinite, as without a certain covering of etherealized matter, even spiritual buildings and spiritual bodies would be invisible to you, and these flames, being the coarse emanations of these degraded spirits, possess for your eyes an appearance even more dense and solid than for the inhabitants themselves." My companion's spirit name was Faithful Friend, a name given him in memory of his devotion to a friend who abused his friendship and finally betrayed him, and whom he had even then forgiven and helped in the hour when shame and humiliation overtook the betrayer, and when reproach and contempt or even revenge might have seemed amply justifiable to many minds. This truly noble spirit had been a man of by no means perfectly noble character in his earthly life, and had therefore passed at death into the lower spheres near the earth plane, but he had risen rapidly, and at the time I met him, he was one of the brotherhood in the second sphere, to which I had so recently been admitted, and had been once before through the kingdoms of hell. We now drew near to what appeared like the crater of a vast volcano, 10,000 Vesuviuses in one. Above us, the sky was black as night, and but for the lurid glare of the flames, we should have been in total darkness. Now that we have reached the mass of fire, I saw that it was like a fiery wall surrounding the country, through which all who sought to enter or leave it must pass. "See now, Franchezzo," said Faithful Friend, "we are about to pass through this wall of fire, but do not let that alarm you, for so long as your courage and your will do not fail, and you exert all your willpower to repel these fiery particles, they cannot come in actual contact with your body. Like the waters of the Red Sea, they will fall apart on either side, and we shall pass through unscathed. Were any one of weak will and timid soul to attempt this, they would fail, and be driven back by the force of these flames, which are propelled outward by a current of strong will force set in motion by the fierce and powerful beings who reign here, and who thus, as they imagine, protect themselves from the intrusions of the higher spheres. To us, however, with our more spiritualized bodies, these flames and the walls and rocks you will find in this land are no more impenetrable than is the solid material of earthly doors and walls, and as we can pass at will through them, so can we pass through these, which are nonetheless sufficiently solid to imprison the spirits who dwell in this country. The more ethereal a spirit is, the less it can be bound by matter, and at the same time, the less direct power can it have in the moving of matter, without the aid of the physical material supplied by the aura of certain mediums. Here, as on earth, we would, in order to move a material substance, require to use the aura of some of the mediumistic spirits of this sphere. At the same time, we shall find that our higher spiritual powers have become muffled, so to say, because in order to enter this sphere and make ourselves visible to its inhabitants, we have had to clothe ourselves in its conditions, and thus we are more liable to be affected by its temptations. Our lower natures will be appealed to in every form, and we shall have to direct our efforts to prevent them from again dominating us. My friend now took my hand firmly in his, and we willed ourselves to pass through the wall of fire. I confess that a momentary sense of fear passed over me as we began to enter it, but I felt we were in for it. So exerting all my powers and concentrating my thoughts, I soon found that we were floating through the flames, forming a fiery arch below and above us, through which, as through a tunnel, we passed. Thinking of it now, I should say it must have been about a quarter to a half a mile thick, judging as one would by earthly measurements, but at the time I did not take sufficient note to be very exact, all my energies being directed to the repelling of the fiery particles from myself. As we emerged, we found ourselves in a land of night. It might have seemed like the bottomless pit of desolation had we not stood upon solid enough ground, while above us was this canopy of black smoke. How far this country extended, it was impossible to form any idea, since the heavy atmosphere like a black fog shut in our vision on every side. I was told that it extended through the whole of this vast and dreadful sphere. In some parts there were great tumbled, jagged mountains of black rocks, in others long and dreary wastes of desert plains, while yet others were mighty swamps of black, oozing mud, full of the most noisome, crawling creatures, slimy monsters, and huge bats. Again, there were dense black forests of gigantic, repulsive-looking trees, almost human in their power and tenacity, encircling and imprisoning those who ventured amongst them. Ere I left this awful land, I had seen these and other dreadful regions, but truly neither I nor anyone else could ever really describe them in all their loathsomeness and foulness. As we stood looking at this country, my sight gradually becoming used to the darkness enabled me to perceive the surrounding objects dimly, and I saw that before us there was a highway marked by the passage of many spirit feet across the black plain on which we stood, a plain covered with dust and ashes, as though the blighted hopes, the dead ashes of misused earthly lives had been scattered there. We followed this highway, and in a short time arrived at a great archway of black stone hewn into large blocks and rudely piled one upon the other. An immense curtain of what I thought at first was black gauze hung before the gateway. On going nearer, I saw to my horror that it was made from spirit's hair, with the eyes strung like beads upon it, and most horrible of all, the eyes were alive and seemed to look at us imploringly and to follow our every movement, as though striving to read our intentions in coming here. "Are these eyes endowed with life?" I asked. "With soul life? No, but with the astral life, yes, and they will continue so to live while the souls to which they belonged continue in the spirit bodies or envelopes from which these eyes have been torn. This is one of the gates of hell, and the custodian has a fancy to decorate it in this way with the eyes of his victims. In this place there are none who have not themselves been guilty during their earthly lives of the most awful cruelties, the most absolute defiance of the laws of mercy and justice. In coming here, they are only intent upon finding fresh means to gratify their lust for cruelty, and thus they expose themselves to becoming in their turn the victims of beings no more ferocious than themselves, but stronger in willpower and cleverer in intellect. This is the city of cruelty, and those who reign here do so by virtue of their very excess of that vice. The wretched spirits to whom these eyes belong, with their degraded, stunted soul germs still imprisoned in their mutilated bodies, are at this moment wandering through the desolation of this land, or laboring as helpless slaves for their spirit tyrants, deprived even of the limited power of sight possessed by others in this dreary land, while between the eyes and their owners there yet exists a connecting link of magnetism, which will keep them living and animated by a reflected life till the soul germ shall cast off its present envelope and rise to a higher state of life. While we were studying this horrible gateway, the curtain of living eyes was drawn aside, and two strange dark beings, half human and half animal, came out, and we took a chance to pass in unnoticed by the guardian of the gate, a gigantic and horrible creature, misshapen and distorted in every limb so that the worst ogre of fable could scarcely convey to mortal mind a picture of him. He sprang out with a frightful laugh and a horrible language upon two poor trembling spirits who fled from him in most abject terror, but neither he nor they seemed able to perceive us. "Are these beings soulless?" I asked, pointing to the poor frightened spirits. "Were they ever on earth?" "Yes, most certainly, but of a very low type of savages, scarcely above the wild beasts, and quite as cruel, hence the reason they are here. In all probability, their means of progression will come from being reincarnated in a slightly higher form of earth life, and their experience here, which will be short, will give them a sense that there is retributive justice somewhere, although they will be apt to form their ideas of a god from their dim recollections of the powerful beings who reign in this place." "Do you then hold doctrine of reincarnation?" "Not as an absolute law under which all spirits must pass, but I do believe that in the experiences of many spirits, reincarnation is a law of their progression. Each spirit or soul born into planetary life has spiritual guardians who from the celestial spheres superintend its welfare and educate the soul by which means as seem best to them in their wisdom. These spiritual guardians, or as some term them, angels, differ in their path methods and their schools of thought, for there is no sameness anywhere, I am taught, and no absolute path upon which all must walk alike. Each school of thought, which has its counterpart, its dim, imperfect reflection on earth, has the perfected system of the school and its highest teachers in the celestial spheres, and from these higher spheres their doctrines are handed down to earth through spirits in the intermediate spheres. The end all have in view is the same, but each maps out a different path by which the pilgrim souls shall reach it. The guardian angels watch over the soul germ during all of what may be termed its childhood and youth, which lasts from the moment it first sees the light of individual consciousness till, through repeated experiences and developments, it attains to such a degree of intellectual and moral consciousness that it stands upon the same level as its spiritual guardians, and then it, in turn, becomes the spiritual guardian of some newborn soul. I have also been taught that the soul germ, in its first stage, is only like a seed, like, in fact, any other seed, in the minuteness of its size and powers. It is, in fact, a spark of the divine essence containing in itself all that will constitute the perfected human soul. Of its very essence, it is immortal and indestructible, because it is seed from that which is immortal and indestructible. But as a seed, it has to be sown into the darkness and degradation of the material earth in order that it may germinate. So has the soul seed to be sown in the corruption of matter, first in its lower and then in its higher forms. Each animal is in itself the type of a soul seed, the human type being the highest of all, and each seed will in turn develop to the highest degree possible for it through successive spheres and experiences. Some schools of thought hold that the soul will progress more rapidly if it is again and again returned to material life to be born anew in a fresh form each time, and to live over again the experiences it has missed, or to expiate in the mortal form the wrongs done in a former incarnation. The spiritual children of this school of thought will indeed be thus returned to earth again, and for them each new lesson will have to be worked out in an earthly life. But it does not follow that this experience will be the lot of all spirits. There are other schools who maintain that the spirit spheres contain means for the education of the soul quite as useful and expeditious, and with the spiritual children committed to their charge, the totally different course of sending them to gather experience in the lower spheres rather than to the earth will be pursued. They will be made to live over in memory their past earth life and to expiate in their spirit the wrongs done in their earthly existences. As each soul differs in its character or individuality, so each must be trained by a different method. else would all resemble each other so exactly that a monotonous sameness would result, and there would be none of the variety and contrast which give a charm to earthly life, and I believe will still continue to do so in the celestial spheres. I have ever been taught, therefore, to avoid trying to found a general rule applicable to all spirits upon the experiences of any one community of spirits with which I may come in contact. Even in the visit we shall pay to this sphere, we shall only be able to see a fractional part of this immense sphere of evil spirits, yet we shall traverse an extent of space far greater than if you had traveled over the whole of the little planet of Earth from which we both have come. In the spirit world, like draws to like by a universal law, and those of entirely opposite natures repel each other so entirely that they can never mingle or even touch the circle in which each dwells. Thus, in our wanderings, we shall only visit those with whom, either from nationality or temperament, we have some germ of feeling, however slight, in common. Chapter 20. The Imperial City. We were now traversing a wide causeway of black marble, on either side of which were deep, dark chasms, of which it was impossible to see the bottom from the great clouds of heavy vapor that hung over them. Passing and repassing us upon this highway were a great many dark spirits, some bearing great heavy loads upon their backs, others almost crawling along on all fours like beasts. Great gangs of slaves passed us, wearing heavy iron collars on their necks and linked together by a heavy chain. They were coming from the second or inner gate of what was evidently a large fortified city, whose dark buildings loomed through the dense masses of dark fog in front of us. The causeway, the style of buildings, and the appearance of many of the spirits made me feel as though we were entering some ancient fortified city of the old Roman Empire, only here everything gave one the sense of being foul and horrible, in spite of the fine architecture and the magnificent buildings whose outlines we could dimly trace. The second gateway was finer in appearance than the first, and the gates being open, we passed in with the stream of spirits hurrying through it, and as before we seemed to pass unseen. "You will perceive," said faithful friend, "that there is a life in no way different from the earthly life of such a city at the time when one of which this is the spiritual reflection, was in full zenith of its power, and when the particles of which this is formed were thrown off from its material life and drawn down by the force of attraction to form this city and these buildings, fit dwellings for its spiritual inhabitants. And you will see in the more modern appearance of many of the buildings and inhabitants how it has been added to from time to time by the same process which is going on continuously. You will notice that most of the spirits here fancy themselves still in the earthly counterpart and wonder why it all looks so dark and foul and dingy. In like manner, this same city has its spiritual prototype in those higher spheres to which all that was fair and good and noble in its life has been attracted, and where those spirits who are good and true have gone to dwell. For in the lives of cities, as of men, the spiritual emanations are attracted upwards or downwards, according as there is good or evil in the deeds done in them. And as the deeds done in this city have in evil far exceeded those which were good, so this city is far larger, far more thickly peopled in this sphere than in those above. In the ages to come, when the spirits who are here now shall have progressed, that heavenly counterpart will be fully finished and fully peopled, and then will this place we gaze at now have crumbled into dust, faded from this sphere. We were now in a narrow street, such as it must have been in the earthly city, and a short distance farther brought us into a large square surrounded with magnificent palaces, while before us towered one more splendid in design than all the others. A great wide flight of marble steps led up to its massive portico, and looming through the dark cloudy atmosphere we could trace its many wings and buildings. All was truly on a magnificent scale, yet all to my eyes appeared dark, stained with great splashes of blood, and covered with slimy fungus growth which disfigured the magnificent and hung in great repulsive-looking festoons, like twisted snakes from all the pillars and copestones of the buildings. Black, slimy mud oozed up through the crevices of the marble pavement, as though the city floated upon a foul swamp, and noisome vapors curled up from the ground and floated above and around us in fantastic and horrible smoke wreaths like a large phantom of past crimes. Everywhere were dark spirits crawling across the great square and in and out of the palace doors, driven onward by other, stronger dark spirits with lash or spear. Such cries of execration as broke forth from time to time, such fearful oaths, such curses and imprecations. It was truly the pandemonium of the lost souls in the infernal regions. And over all hung those black night clouds of sorrow and suffering and wrong. Far away to the earth my thoughts traveled, back to the days of the Roman Empire, and I saw reflected, as in a glass, this city in all the splendor of her power, in all the iniquities of her tyranny and her crimes, weaving down below, from the loom of fate, this other palace of retribution for all those men and women who disgraced her beauties by their sins. I saw this great city of hell building atom by atom till it should become a great prison for all evil spirits of that wicked time. We went up a wide flight of steps through the lofty doorway and found ourselves in the outer court of the emperor's palace. No one spoke to us or seemed aware of our presence, and we were passed on through several smaller halls till we reached the door of the presence chamber. Here my companion stopped and said, "I cannot enter with you, friend, because I have already visited the dark spirit who reigns here, and therefore my presence would at once excite his suspicions and defeat the object of your visit, which is that you may rescue an unhappy spirit whose repentant prayers have reached the higher spheres and will be answered by the help you are sent to give. You will find the person you seek without any difficulty. His desire for help has already drawn us thus near to him and will draw you still closer. I must now for a time part from you, because I have my own path of work to follow, but we shall meet again ere long, and if you but keep a stout heart and a strong will and do not forget the warnings given you, no harm can befall you. Adieu, my friend, and know that I also shall need all my powers." Thus then I parted from faithful friend and passed out alone in the council chamber, which I found thronged with spirits, both men and women, furnished with all the barbaric splendor of the days of the emperors. Yet to my sight there was over everything the same stamp of foul loathsomeness which had struck me in the exterior of the palace. The men and women, haughty patricians in their lives no doubt, appeared to be eaten up with a loathsome disease like lepers, only they were even more horrible to look upon. The walls and floor seemed stained with dark pools of blood and hung with evil thoughts for drapery. Worm-eaten, corrupting were the stately robes these haughty spirits wore, and saturated with the disease germs from their corrupted bodies. On a great throne sat the emperor himself, the most foul and awful example of degraded intellect and manhood in all that vast crowd of degraded spirits, while stamped upon his features was such a look of cruelty and vice that beside him the others sank into insignificance by comparison. I could not but admire, even while it revolted me, the majestic power of this man's intellect and will, the kingly sense of power over even such a motley crew as these, the feeling that even in hell he reigned as by right, seemed to minister to his pride and love of dominion even in the midst of his awful surroundings. Looking at him, I beheld him for one brief moment, not as I saw him and he saw these disgusting creatures round him, but as he still appeared in his own eyes, which even after all these centuries were not opened to his true state, his real self. I saw him as a haughty, handsome man, with cruel, clear-cut features, hard expression, and eyes like a wild vulture, yet withal possessing a certain beauty of form, a certain power to charm. All that was repulsive and vile was hidden by the earthly envelope, not revealed as now in all the nakedness of spirit. I saw his court and his companions change back to the likeness of their earthly lives, and I knew that to each and all they appeared just the same in their own eyes. All were alike unconscious of the horrible change in themselves, yet perfectly conscious of the change in each of their companions. Were all unconscious? No, not quite all. There was one man crouching in a corner, his mantle drawn over his disfigured face, whom I perceived to be fully conscious of his own vileness as well as the vileness of all who surrounded him. and in this man's heart there had sprung up a desire, hopeless as it seemed to himself, for better things, for a path to open before him, which, however hard and thorny, might lead him from this night of hell and give him even at this 11th hour the hope of a life removed from the horrors of this place and these associates. And as I looked, I knew it was to this man I was sent, though how I was to help him I knew not, I could not guess. I only felt that the power which had led me so far would open up my path and show me the way. While I had stood thus gazing around me, the dark spirits and their ruler became conscious of my presence, and a look of anger and ferocity passed over his face, while in a voice thick and hoarse with passion he demanded who I was and how I dared to enter his presence. I answered, I am a stranger, only lately come to this dark sphere, and I am still lost in wonder at finding such a place in the spirit world. A wild, ferocious laugh broke from the spirit, and he cried out that they would soon enlighten me as to many things in the spirit world. But since you are a stranger, he continued, and because we always receive strangers right royally here, I pray you to be seated and partake with us of our feast. He pointed to a vacant seat at the long table in front of him, at which many of the spirits were seated, and which was spread with what bore the semblance of a great feast, such as might have been given in the days of his earthly grandeur. Everything looked real enough, but I had been warned that it was all more or less illusionary, that the food never satisfied the awful cravings of hunger which these former gluttons felt, and that the wine was a fiery liquid which scorched the throat and rendered 1,000 times worse the thirst which consumed these drunkards. I had been told to neither eat nor drink anything offered me in these regions, nor to accept any invitation to rest myself given by these beings, for to do so would mean the subjugation of my higher powers to the senses once more, and would at once put me on a level with these dark beings and into their power. I answered, while I fully appreciate the motives which prompt you to offer me the hospitality of your palace, I must still decline it, as I have no desire to either eat or drink anything. At this rebuff his eyes shot gleams of living fire at me, and a deeper shade of anger crossed his brow, but he still maintained a pretense of graciousness and signed to me to approach yet nearer to him. Meanwhile, the man who I had come to help, aroused from his bitter meditations by my arrival and the emperor's speech with me, had drawn near in wonder at my boldness and alarmed for my safety, for he knew no more of me than I seemed some unlucky new arrival who had not yet learned the dangers of this horrible place. His anxiety for me and a certain sense of pity created a link between us, which, unknown to either, was to be the means whereby I would be able to draw him away with me. When I advanced a few steps toward the emperor's throne, this repentant spirit followed me, and coming close whispered, Do not be beguiled by him. Turn and fly from this place while there is yet time, and I will draw their attention from you for the moment. I thanked the spirit, but said, I shall not fly from any man, be he whom he may, and will take care not to fall into any trap. Our hurried speech had not been unnoticed by the emperor, for he became most impatient, and striking his sword upon the ground, he cried out to me, Approach, stranger! Have you no manners that you keep an emperor waiting? Behold my chair of state, my throne. Seat yourself in it, and try it for a moment, how it feels to be in an emperor's palace. I looked at the throne as he pointed, and saw it was like a great chair with a canopy over it. 2 immense winged figures in bronze stood at the back of the seat, each with 6 long arms extended to form the back and sides, while upon the heads of these figures the canopy rested, as upon pillars. I had no thought to sit in such a place. Its late occupant was too repulsive to me to desire to go any nearer to him, but had even curiosity made me wish to examine the chair, the sight I saw would have effectually prevented me. The chair seemed suddenly to become endowed with life, and before my eyes I beheld a vision of an unhappy spirit struggling in the embraces of those awful arms which encircled it and crushed its body into a mangled, writhing mass. I knew that such was the fate of all those whom the emperor induced to try the comforts of his chair. Only for one brief instant the vision lasted, and then I turned to the emperor and, bowing, said to him, I have no desire to place myself upon your level, and must again decline the honor you would do me." Then he broke into a tempest of rage and cried out to his guards to seize me and thrust me into the chair and pour the food and wine down my throat till they choked me. Immediately there was a rush made towards me, the man I had come to save throwing himself before me to protect me, and in a moment we were surrounded by a seething, fighting mass of spirits, and for that moment, I confess, my heart sank within me, and my courage began to fail. They looked so horrible, so fiendish, so like a pack of wild beasts let loose and all setting upon me at once. Only for a moment, however, for the conflict aroused all my combative qualities of which I have been thought to possess my fair share. And I threw out all my will to repel them, calling upon all good powers to aid me, while I grasped firm hold of the poor spirit who had sought to help me. Thus I retreated to the door step by step, the whole crowd of dark spirits following us with wild cries and menacing gestures, yet unable to touch us, while I kept my firm determination to keep them off. At last we reached the door and passed through it, whereupon it seemed to close fast and keep in our pursuers. Then strong arms seemed to lift us both up and bear us away into a place of safety on the dark plain. My rescued companion was by this time in a state of unconsciousness, and as I stood by him, I saw 4 majestic spirits from the higher spheres making magnetic passes over his prostrate form, and then I beheld the most wonderful sight I had ever seen. From the dark, disfigured body, which lay as in a sleep of death, there arose a mist-like vapor, which grew more and more dense till it took shape in the form of the spirit himself, the purified soul of that poor spirit released from its dark envelope. And I saw those 4 angelic spirits lift the still unconscious, risen soul in their arms as one would bear a child, and then they all floated away from me, up, till they vanished from my sight. At my side stood another bright angel, who said to me, "Be of good cheer, O son of the land of hope, for many shalt thou help in this dark land, and great is the joy of the angels in heaven over these sinners that have repented." As he finished speaking, he vanished, and I was alone once more on the bleak plains of hell. Chapter 21. The Fires of Hell, a Vengeful Spirit, Pirates, the Sea of Foul Mud, the Mountains of Selfish Oppression, the Forest of Desolation, Messages of Love. Away before me stretched a narrow path, and curious to see where it would lead, I followed it, sure that it would somehow lead me to those whom I could help. After following it for a short time, I came to the foot of a range of black mountains, and before me was the entrance to a huge cavern. Horrible reptiles were hanging onto the walls and crawling at my feet. Great funguses and monstrous air plants of an oozy, slimy kind hung in festoons, like ragged shrouds from the roof, and a dark pool of stagnant water almost covered the floor. I thought of turning away from this spot, but a voice seemed to bid me to go on, so I entered, and skirting around the edge of the dark pool, found myself at the entrance to a small, dark passage in the rocks. Down this I went, and turning a corner, saw before me a red light, as from a fire, while dark forms like goblins passed and repassed between it and myself. Another moment, and I stood at the end of the passage. Before me was a gigantic, dungeon-like vault, its uneven, rocky roof half revealed and half hidden by the masses of lurid smoke and flames which arose from an enormous fire blazing in the middle of the cavern, while round it were dancing such a troop of demons as might well typify the devils of hell. With shrieks and yells of laughter, they were prodding at the fire with long black spears, and dancing and flinging themselves about in the wildest fashion, while in a corner were huddled together a dozen or so of miserable dark spirit, towards whom they made frantic rushes from time to time, as if about to seize and hurl them into the fire, always retreating again with yells and howls of rage. I soon perceived that I was invisible to these beings, so taking courage from that fact, I drew nearer. To my horror, I discovered that the fire was composed of bodies of living men and women who writhed and twisted in the flames and were tossed about by the spears of those awful demons. I was so appalled by this discovery that I cried out to know if this was a real scene or only some horrible illusion of this dreadful place, and the same deep, mysterious voice that had often spoken to me in my wanderings answered me now. Son, they are living souls who in their earthly lives doomed hundreds of their fellow men to die this dreadful death, and knew no pity, no remorse in doing so. Their own cruelties have kindled these fierce flames of passion and hate in the breast of their many victims. And in the spirit world, these fiery germs have grown till they are now a fierce flame to consume the oppressors. These fires are fed solely by the fierce cruelties of those they now consume. There is not here one pang of anguish from which has not been suffered 100-fold more in the persons of these spirits, many helpless victims. From this fire these spirits will come forth, touched by a pity born of their own sufferings for those they wronged in the past, and then will be extended to them the hand of help and means of progression through deeds of mercy as many and as great as have been their merciless deeds in the past. Do not shudder nor marvel that such retribution as this is allowed to be. The souls of these spirits were so hard, so cruel, that only sufferings felt by themselves could make them pity others. Even since they left the earth life, they have only been intent upon making others more helpless suffer, till the bitter hatred they have aroused has become at last a torrent which has engulfed themselves. Furthermore, know that these flames are not truly material, although to your eyes and to theirs they appear so, for in the spirit world that which is mental is likewise objective, and the fierce hatred or burning passion does indeed seem a living fire. You shall now follow one of these spirits and see for yourself that what seems to you cruel justice is yet mercy in disguise. Behold, these passions are burning themselves out, and the souls are about to pass into the darkness of the plain beyond. As the voice ceased, the flames died down, and all was darkness, save for a faint bluish light like phosphorus that filled the cavern, and by it I saw the forms of the spirits rise from the ashes of the fire and pass out of the cavern. As I followed them, one became separated from the others, and passing on before me went into the streets of a city that was near. It seemed to me like one of the old Spanish cities of the West Indies or South America. There were Indians passing along its streets and mingling with Spaniards and men of several other nations. Following the spirit through several streets, we came to a large building, which seemed to be a monastery of the order of Jesuits, who had helped to colonize the country and force upon the unhappy natives the Roman Catholic religion, in the days when religious persecution was thought by most creeds to be a proof of religious zeal. And then, while I stood watching this spirit, I saw pass before me a panorama of his life. I saw him first chief of his order, sitting as a judge before whom were brought many poor Indians and heretics, and I saw him condemning them by the hundreds to torture and flames because they would not become converts to his teachings. I saw him oppressing all who were not powerful enough to resist him and extorting jewels and gold in enormous quantities as tribute to him and his order. If any sought to resist him and his demands, he had them arrested, and almost without even the pretense of a trial, thrown into dungeons and tortured and burned. I read in his heart a perfect thirst for wealth and power and an actual love for beholding the suffering of his victims, and I knew, reading as I seemed to do his innermost soul, that his religion was but a cloak, a convenient name under which to extort the gold he loved and gratify his love of power. Again, I saw the great square or marketplace of this city with hundreds of great fires blazing all around it till it was like a furnace, and a whole helpless crowd of timid, gentle natives were bound hand and foot, thrown into the flames, and their cities of agony went up to heaven as this cruel man and his vile accomplices chanted their false prayers and held aloft the sacred cross which was desecrated by their unholy hands, their horrible lives of cruelty and vice, and their greed for gold. I saw that this horror was perpetrated in the name of the Church of Christ, of him whose teachings were of love and charity, who came to teach that God was perfect love. And I saw this man who called himself Christ's minister, and yet had no thought of pity for one of these unhappy victims. He thought alone of how the spectacle would strike terror to the hearts of other Indian tribes and make them bring him more gold to satisfy his greed lust. Then I beheld this man return to his own land of Spain and, reveling in all his ill-gotten wealth, a powerful wealthy prince of the church, venerated by the poor ignorant populace as a holy man who had gone forth into that western world beyond the seas to plant the banner of his church and preach the blessed gospel of love and peace while instead his path had been marked in fire and blood, and then my sympathy for him was gone. Then I saw this man upon his deathbed, and I saw monks and priests chanting mass for his soul, that it might go to heaven, and instead I saw it drawn down and down to hell by the chains woven in his wicked life. I saw the great hordes of his former victims awaiting him there, drawn down in their turn by their thirst for revenge, their hunger for power, to avenge their suffering and the suffering of those most dear to them. I saw this man in hell surrounded by those he had wronged, and haunted by the empty wraiths of such as were too good and pure to come to this place of horror or to wish for vengeance on their murder, just as I had seen in the frozen land with the man in the icy cage. And in hell, the only thought of that spirit was rage, because his power on earth was no more. His only idea how he might join with others in hell as cruel as himself, and thus still oppress and torture. If he could have doomed his victims to death a second time, he would have done it. In his heart there was neither pity nor remorse, only anger that he was so powerless. Had he possessed one feeling of sorrow or one thought of kindness for another, it would have helped him and created a wall between himself and these vengeful spirits. And his sufferings, though they might be great, would not have at last assumed the physical aspect in which I had beheld them. As it was, his passion of cruelty was so great it fed and fanned into fresh life the spiritual flames which theirs created, till at last, when I saw him first, they were dying out exhausted by their own violence. Those demons I had beheld were the last and most fierce of his victims, in whom the desire for revenge was even then not fully satisfied, while those I had beheld crouching in the corner were some who, no longer desirous of tormenting him themselves, had yet been unable to withdraw themselves from beholding his sufferings and those of his accomplices. And now I beheld that spirit with the newly awakened thought of repentance returning to the city to warn others of his Jesuit fraternity and to try to turn them from the path of his own errors. He did not yet realize the length of time that had collapsed since he had left the earth life, nor that this city was the spiritual counterpart of the one he had lived in on earth. In time, I was told, he would be sent back to earth to work as a spirit in helping to teach mortals the pity and mercy he had not shown in his own life. But first he would have to work here in this dark place, striving to release the souls of those whom his crimes had dragged down with him. Thus I left this man at the door of that building, which was the counterpart of his earthly house, and passed on by myself through the city. Like the Roman city, this one was disfigured, and its beauties blotted out by the crimes of which it had been the silent witness. And to me the air seemed full of dark, phantom forms, wailing and weeping and dragging after them in their heavy chains. The whole place seemed to be built upon living graves and shrouded in a dark red mist of blood and tears. It was like one vast prison house, whose walls were built of deeds of violence and robbery and oppression. As I wandered on, I had a waking dream and saw the city as it had been on earth ere the white man had set his foot upon its soil. I saw peaceful, primitive people living upon fruits and grains and leading their simple lives in an innocence akin to that of childhood, worshipping the great Supreme under a name of their own, yet nonetheless worshipping him in spirit and in truth, their simple faith and their patient virtues the outcome of the inspiration given for them from the Great Spirit, who is universal and belongs to no creeds, no churches. Then I saw white men come thirsting for gold and greedy to grasp the goods of the others, and these simple people welcomed them like brothers, and in their innocence showed them the treasures they had gathered from the earth, gold and silver and jewels. Then I saw the treachery which marked the path of the white man, how they plundered and killed the simple natives, how they tortured and made slaves of them, forcing them to labor in the mines till they died by thousands, how all faith, all promises were broken by the white man, till the peacefully happy country was filled with tears and blood. Then I beheld, afar, away in Spain, a few good, true, kindly men whose souls were pure, and who believed that they alone had the true faith by which only man can be saved and live eternally, who thought that God had given this light to but one small spot of his earth, and had left all the rest in the darkness and error, had left countless thousands to perish because this light had been denied to them, but given exclusively to that one small spot of earth, that small section of his people. I thought that these good and pure men were so sorry for those who they thought were in darkness and error of a false religion, and that they set forth and crossed that unknown ocean to that strange, faraway land to carry with them their system of religion and to give it to those poor simple people whose lives have been so good and gentle and spiritual under their own faith, their own beliefs. I saw these good but ignorant priests land on this strange shore and beheld them working everywhere amongst the natives, spreading their own belief and crushing out and destroying all traces of a primitive faith as worthy of respect as their own. These priests were kind, good men who sought to alleviate the physical lot of the poor, oppressed natives, even while they labored for their spiritual welfare also, and on every side there sprang up missions, churches, and schools. I beheld great numbers of men, priests as well as many others, come over from Spain, eager, not for the good of the church, nor to spread the truths of their religion, but only greedy for the gold of this new land, and for all that could minister to their own gratification, men whose lives had disgraced them in their own country, till they were obliged to fly to this strange one, to escape the consequences of their misdeeds. I saw these men arrive in hordes and mingle with those whose motives were pure and good, till they had outnumbered them, and then thrust the good aside everywhere, and made of themselves tyrannical masters over the unhappy natives, in the name of the Holy Church of Christ. And then I saw the Inquisition brought to the unhappy land and established as the last link in chain of slavery and oppression, thus riveted around this unhappy people, till it swept almost all of them from the face of the earth. And everywhere I beheld the wild thirst, the greed for gold that consumed, as with a fire of hell, all who sought that land. Blind were most of them to all its beauties but its gold, deaf to all thought but how they might enrich themselves with it, and in the madness of that time, in that awful craving for wealth, was this city of hell, this spiritual counterpart of the earthly city built, stone upon stone, particle by particle, forming between itself and the city of earth chains of attraction, which should draw down, one by one, each of its wicked inhabitants. For truly the earth lives are building for each man and woman their spiritual habitations. Thus all these monks and priests, all these fine ladies, all these soldiers and merchants, yea, and even these unhappy natives had been drawn down to hell by the deeds of their earthly lives, by the passions and hatreds, the greed of gold, the bitter sense of wrongs unrequited, and the thirst for revenge which those deeds had created. At the door of a large square building, whose small grated windows looked like a prison, I stopped, arrested by the cries and shouts which came from it. Then, guided by the mysterious voice of my unseen guide, I entered, and following the sounds, soon came to a dungeon cell. Here I found a great number of spirits, surrounding a man who was chained to the wall by an iron girdle round his waist. His wild, glaring eyes, disheveled hair, and tattered clothing suggested that he had been there for many years, while the hollow, sunken cheeks and the bones sticking through his skin told that he was, to all appearance, dying of starvation. Yet I knew that here there was no death, no such relief from suffering. Near him stood another man with folded arms and a bowed head, whose wasted features and skeleton form, scarred with many wounds, made him even more pitiable an object than the other, though he was free while the other was chained to the wall. Around them both danced and yelled other spirits, all wild and savage and degraded. Some of them were Indians, a few Spanish, and one or two looked, I thought, like Englishmen. All were the same work, throwing sharp knives at the chained man that never seemed to hit him, shaking their fists in his face, cursing and reviling him, yet, strange to say, never able to actually touch him, and all the time there he stood, chained to the wall, unable to move or get away from them, and there stood the other man, silently watching him. As I stood looking at this scene, I became conscious of the past history of those two men. I saw the one who was chained to the wall in a handsome house, like a palace, and I knew he had been one of the judges sent out from Spain to preside over the so-called courts of justice, which had but proved additional means for extorting money from the natives and oppressing all who sought to interfere with the rich and powerful. I saw the other man, who had been a merchant, living in a pretty villa with a beautiful, very beautiful wife and one little child. This woman had attracted the notice of the judge, who conceived an unholy passion for her, and on her persistently repulsing all his advances, he made an excuse to have the husband arrested on suspicion by the Inquisition and thrown into prison. Then he carried off the poor wife, and so insulted her that she died, and the poor little child was strangled by order of the cruel judge. Meantime, the unfortunate husband lay in prison, ignorant of the fate of his wife and child, and of the charge under which he had been arrested, growing more and more exhausted from the scanty food and horrors of the dungeon, and more desperate from the suspense. At last he was brought before the Council of Inquisition, charged with heretical practices and conspiracy against the crown, and on denial of these charges was tortured to make him confess and give up the names of certain of his friends who were accused of being his accomplices. As the poor man, bewildered and indignant, still protested his innocence, he was sent back to his dungeon and there slowly starved to death, the cruel judge not daring to set him at liberty, well knowing that he would make the city ring with the story of his wrongs and his wife's fate when he should learn it. As so, this poor man had died, but he did not join his wife, who, poor injured soul, had passed at once with her little innocent child into the higher spheres. She was so good and pure and gentle that she had even forgiven her murderer, for such he was, though he had not intended to kill her, and between her and the husband she so dearly loved, there was a wall created by this bitter, revengeful feeling against the man who had destroyed them both. When this poor wronged husband died, his soul could not leave the earth. It was tied there by his hatred of his enemy and his thirst for revenge. His own wrongs he might have forgiven, but the fate of his wife and child had to be too dreadful. He could not forgive that. Before even his love for his wife came this hate, and day and night his spirit clung fast to the judge, seeking for the chance of vengeance. And at last it came. Devils from hell, such as had once tempted me, clustered round the wrong spirit and taught it how, through the hand of a mortal, it could strike the assassin's dagger to the judge's heart, and then when death severed the body and spirit, he could drag that down with him to hell. So terrible had been this craving for revenge, nursed through the waiting years of solitude in prison and in the spirit land, that the poor wife had tried and tried in vain to draw near her husband and soften his heart with better thoughts. Her gentle soul was shut out by the wall of evil drawn around the unhappy man, and he also had no hope of ever seeing her again. He deemed that she had gone to heaven and was lost to him forevermore. A Roman Catholic of the narrow views held nearly 200 years ago, when this man had lived, he believed that being under the ban of its priests and denied the ministrations of the church when he died was the reason he was one of the eternally lost, while his wife and child must be with the angels of heaven. Is it wonderful, then, that all this poor spirit's thoughts should center in the desire for vengeance, and that he should plan only on how to make his enemy suffer as he had been made to suffer? Thus, then, it was he who inspired a man on earth to kill the judge. His hand guided the mortals with so unerring an aim that the judge fell, pierced to his false, cruel heart. The earthly body died, but the immortal soul lived and awakened to find itself in hell, chained to a dungeon wall as he had chained his victim, and face to face with him at last. There were others whom the judge had wronged and sent to a death of suffering to gratify his anger or to enrich himself at the expense, and these all gathered round him and made his awakening a hell indeed. Yet such was the indomitable strength of will of this man that none of the blows aimed at him could touch him, none of the missiles strike, and thus through all the years had those two deadly enemies faced each other, pouring out their hatred and defiance, while those other spirits, like the chorus of a Greek tragedy, came and then went and amused themselves, devising fresh means to torment the chained man, whose strong will kept them at bay. And away in the bright spheres mourned the poor wife, striving and hoping till the time should come when her influence would be felt even in this awful place, when her love and her unceasing prayers should reach the soul of her husband and soften, that he might relent in his bitter purpose and turn from his revenge. It was her prayers which had drawn me to this dungeon, and it was her soul which spoke to mine, telling me all the sad, cruel story, and pleading with me to carry to her unhappy husband the knowledge that she lived only in thoughts of him, only in the hope that he would be drawn by her love to the upper spheres to join her in peace and happiness at last. With this vision strong upon me, I drew near the sullen man, who was growing tired of his revenge, and whose heart was full of longing for the wife he loved so passionately. I touched him upon the shoulder and said, "Friend, I know you are here, and all the cruel story of your wrongs, and I am sent from her you love to tell you that in the bright land above she awaits you, wearying that you do not come, and marveling that you can find revenge more sweet than her caresses, she bids me tell you that you chain yourself here when you might be free. The spirit started as I spoke, then, turning to me, grasped my arm and gazed long and earnestly into my face as though to read there whether I spoke truly or falsely. Then he sighed as he drew back, saying, "Who are you, and why do you come here? You are like none of those who belong to this awful place, and your words are words of hope. Yet how can there be hope for the soul in hell? There is hope, even here, for hope is eternal, and God in his mercy shuts none out from it, whatever man in his earth-distorted image of the divine teachings may do. I am sent to give hope to you and others who are like you in sorrow for the past, and if you will but come with me, I can show you how to reach the better land." I saw that he hesitated, and a bitter struggle went on in his heart, for he knew that it was his presence which kept his enemy a prisoner, that were he to go, the other would be free to wander through this dark land, and even yet he could hardly let him go. Then I spoke again of his wife, his child. Would he not rather go to them? The strong, passionate man broke down as he thought of those loved ones, and burying his face in his hands wept bitter tears. I put my arm through his and led him, unresisting, out of the prison and out of the city. Here we found kind spirit friends were awaiting the poor man, and with them I left him, that they might bear him to a bright land where he would see his wife from time to time, till he worked himself up to the level of her sphere, where they would be united forever, in happiness more perfect than could have ever been their lot on earth. I did not return to the city, for I felt my work there was done, and so wandered on in search of fresh fields of usefulness. In the middle of a dark, lonely plain, I came upon a solitary hut, in which I found a man lying on some wisps of dirty straw, unable to move, and to all appearance dying. He told me that in his earth life he had thus abandoned and left to die a sick comrade, whom he had robbed of the gold for which they had both risked their lives, and that now he also was dead, he found himself lying in the same helpless, deserted way. I asked him if he would not wish to get up and go and do something to help others, and thus atone for the murder of his friend, because if so, I thought I could help him. He thought he would like to get up, certainly. He was sick of this hole, but he did not see why he should work at anything or bother about other people. He would rather look for the money he had buried and spend that. Here his cunning eyes glanced furtively at me to see what I thought of his money and if I was likely to try to find it. I suggested to him that he ought rather to think of trying to find the friend he had murdered and make reparation to him. But he wouldn't hear of that and got quite angry, said he was not sorry he had killed his friend, and only sorry he was here. He thought I would have helped him to get away. I tried to talk to this man and make him see how he really might better his position and undo the wrong he had done, but it was no use. His only idea was that once given the use of his limbs again, he could go and rob or kill someone else. So, at last I left him where he lay, and as I went out, his feeble hand picked up a stone and flung it after me. What, I asked mentally, will become of this man? I was answered, he has just come from earth after dying a violent death, and his spirit is weak, but ere long he will grow strong, and then he will go forth and join other marauders like himself who go about in bands and add another horror to this place. After the lapse of many years, it may even be centuries, the desire for better things will awake, and he will begin to progress, but very slowly, for the soul which has been in chains so long and is so poorly developed, so degraded, as in this man, often takes cycles of time to develop its dormant powers. After I had wandered for some time over this dreary, desolate plain, I felt so tired, weary of heart, that I sat down and began musing upon what I had seen in this awful sphere. The sight of so much evil and suffering had depressed me. The awful darkness and the heavy murky clouds oppressed my soul that ever had loved the sunshine and the light as I fancy only we of the southern nations love it. And then I wearied. Ah, how I wearied and longed for news from her whom I had left on earth. No word had reached me as yet from my friends, no news of my beloved. I knew not how long I had been in this place, where there was no day to mark time, nothing but eternal night that brooded and reigned in silence over everything. My thoughts were full of my beloved, and I prayed earnestly that she might be kept safe on earth to gladden my eyes when the time of probation in this place should be over. While I prayed, I became conscious of a soft, pale light suffused around me as from a glowing star that grew and grew till it expanded and opened out into a most glorious picture framed in rays of light, and in the center I saw my darling, her eyes looking into mine and smiling at me, her sweet lips parted, as though speaking my name. Then she seemed to raise her hand, and touching her lips with her fingertips, threw me a kiss. So shyly, so prettily was it done that I was in raptures, and rose to return her that kiss, to look more closely at her, and lo, the vision had vanished, and I was alone on the dark plain once more, but no longer sad. That bright vision had cheered me and given me hope and courage to go on once more and bring to others such hope as cheered myself. I arose and went on again. In a short time was overtaken by a number of dark and most repulsive-looking spirits. They wore ragged black cloaks and seemed to have their faces concealed by black masks like spectral highwaymen. They did not see me, and I had found that as a rule the dwellers of this sphere were too low in intelligence and spiritual sight to be able to see anyone from the spheres above unless brought into direct contact with them. Curious to see what they were about, I drew back and followed them at a little distance. Presently another party of dark spirits approached, carrying what looked like bags with some sort of treasure. Immediately they were attacked by the first comers. They had no weapons in their hands, but they fought like wild beasts with teeth and claws, their fingernails being like the claws of a wild animal or a vulture. They fastened upon each other's throats and tore them. They scratched and bit like tigers or wolves, till one half, at least, were left lying helpless upon the ground, while the rest rushed off with the treasure, which to me seemed only lumps of hard stone. When all who were able to move had gone, I drew near the poor spirits lying moaning on the ground to see if I could help any of them, but it seemed to be no use doing so. They only tried to turn upon me and tear me in pieces. They were more like savage beasts than men. Even their bodies were bent like a beast's, the arms long like an ape's, the hands hard, the fingers and nails like claws, and they half walked, half crawled on all fours. The faces could scarcely be called human. The very features had become bestial while changing into animals, and I felt I could almost have believed these were such creatures. In their horrible, glaring eyes was an expression of calculation and cunning, which was certainly human, and the motions of their hands were not like those of animal. Moreover, they had speech, and were mingling their howls and groans with oaths and curses and foul language unknown to animals. "Are there souls even here?" I asked. Again came the answer, yes, even here. Lost, degraded, dragged down, and smothered, till almost all traces lost. Yet even here there are the germs of souls. These men were pirates of the Spanish Main highwaymen, freebooters, slave dealers, and kidnappers of men. They have so brutalized themselves that almost all trace of the human is merged in the wild animal. Their instincts were those of savage beasts. Now they live like beasts and fight like them. And for them is there still hope? And can anyone help them? I asked. Even for these there is hope, though many will not avail themselves of it for ages yet to come. Yet here are others who even now can be helped. I turned, and at my feet lay a man who had dragged himself to me with great difficulty, and was now too exhausted for further effort. He was less horrible to look at than the others, and in his distorted face there were traces of better things. I bent over him and heard his lips murmur, "Water, water for any sake. Give me water, for I am consumed with a living fire." I had no water to give him, and knew not where to get any in this land, but I gave him a few drops of essence I had brought from the land of dawn for myself. The effect upon him was like magic. It was an elixir. He sat up and stared at me and said, "You must be a magician. That has cooled me and put out the fire that has burned within me for years. I have been filled with a living fire of thirst ever since I came to this hell." I had now drawn him away from the others and began to make passes over his body, and as I did, so his suffering ceased and he grew quiet and restful. I was standing by him, wondering what to do next, whether to speak or to go away and leave him to himself, when he caught my hand and kissed it passionately. "Oh, friend, how am I to thank you? What shall I call you, who have come to give me relief after all these years of suffering? If you are thus grateful to me, would you not wish to earn the gratitude of others by helping them? Shall I show you how you could?" "Yes. "Oh yes, most gladly, if only you will take me with you, good friend." "Well then, let me help you up, and if you are able we had better leave this spot as soon as we can," said I, and together we set forth to see what we could do. My companion told me he had been a pirate and in the slave trade. He had been mate of a ship and was killed in a fight, and had awakened to find himself and others of the crew in this dark place. How long he had been there, he had no idea, but it seemed like eternity. He and other spirits like him went about in bands and were always fighting. When they did not meet another party to fight, they fought amongst themselves. The thirst for fighting was the only excitement they could get in this horrible place, where there was never any drink to be got which could quench the awful burning thirst which consumed them all. What they drank only seemed to make them 1,000 times worse, and was like pouring living fire down their throats. Then he said, "You never could die, no matter what you suffered. That was the awful curse of the thing. You had got beyond death, and it was no use trying to kill yourself or get others to kill you. There was no such escape from suffering. We are like a lot of hungry wolves," he said. "For want of anyone to attack us, we used to fall upon each other and fight till we were exhausted, and then we would lie moaning and suffering till we recovered enough to go forth again and attack someone else. I have been longing for any means of escape. I have almost got to praying for it at last. I felt I would do anything if God would only forgive me and let me have another chance. And when I saw you standing near me, I thought perhaps you were an angel sent down to me after all. Only you've got no wings nor anything of that sort, as they paint them in pictures. But then pictures don't give you much idea of this place, and if they are wrong about one place, why not about the other?" I laughed at him. Yes, even in that place of sorrow, I laughed. My heart felt so much lightened to find myself of so much use. And then I told him who I was and how I came to be there, and he said if I wanted to help people, there were some dismal swamps near, where a great many unhappy spirits were imprisoned, and he could take me to them and help a bit himself, he thought. He seemed afraid to let me go out of his sight, lest I should disappear and leave him alone again. I felt quite attracted to this man because he seemed so very grateful, and I was also glad of companionship of any sort, except that of those most repulsive beings who seem the majority of the dwellers here, for I felt lonely and somewhat desolate in this far-off, dismal country. The intense darkness, the horrible atmosphere of thick fog made it almost impossible to see far in any direction, so that we reached the land of swamps before I was aware of it, except for feeling a cold, damp, offensive air which blew in our faces. Then I saw looming before me a great sea of liquid mud, black, fetid, and stagnant, a thick slime of oily blackness floating on top. Here and there monstrous reptiles with huge inflated bodies and projecting eyes were wallowing. Great bats with almost human faces like vampires hovered over it, while black and gray smoke wreaths of noisome vapor rose from its decaying surface and hung over it in weird, fantastic phantom shapes that shifted and changed ever and anon into fresh forms of ugliness, now waving aloft wild arms and shaking, nodding, gibbering heads, which seemed almost endowed with a sense of speech, then melting into mist again, to form into some new creature of repulsive horror. On the shores of this great foul sea were innumerable crawling, slimy creatures of hideous shape and gigantic size that lay sprawling on their backs or plunged into that horrid sea. I shuddered as I looked upon it, and was about to ask if there could indeed be lost souls struggling in that filthy slime when my ears heard a chorus of wailing cries and calls for help coming from the darkness before me that touched my heart with their mournful hopelessness, and my eyes, growing more accustomed to the mist, distinguished here and there struggling human forms wading up to their armpits in the mud. I called to them and told them to try to walk towards me, for I was on the shore, but they either could not see or could not hear me, for they took no notice, and my companion said he believed they were both deaf and blind to everything but their immediate surroundings. He had been in the sea of foul mud himself for a time, but had managed to struggle out, though he had understood that most were unable to do so without help from another, and that some went on stumbling about in it for years. Again, we heard those pitiful cries, and one sounded so near us that I thought of plunging in myself and trying to drag the wretched spirit out. But it was horrible, too disgusting. I recoiled in horror at the thought, and then again that despairing cry smote upon my ears and made me feel I must venture it. So in I went, trying my best to stifle my sense of disgust, and guided by the cries, soon reached the man, the great phantoms of the mist wavering and swooping and rushing overhead as I did so. He was up to his neck in the mud and seemed sinking lower when I found him, and it seemed impossible for me alone to draw him out, so I called to the pirate spirit to come and help me, but he was nowhere to be seen. Thinking he had only led me into a trap and deserted me, I was about to turn and struggle out again, when the unfortunate spirit besought me so pitifully not to abandon him that I made another great effort and succeeded in dragging him a few yards and drawing his feet out of a trap of weeds at the bottom in which they appeared to be caught. Then somehow I half dragged, half supported him till we reached the shore, where the unfortunate spirit sank down in unconsciousness. I was a good deal exhausted also, and sat down beside him to rest. I looked round for my pirate friend, and beheld him wallowing about in the sea at some distance, and evidently bringing out someone along with him. Even in the midst of my awful surroundings, I could not help feeling a certain sense of amusement in looking at him. He made such a frantic and exaggerated effort to haul along the unlucky spirit, and was so shouting and going on that it was calculated to alarm anyone who was timid, and I did not wonder to hear the poor spirit almost imploring not to be so energetic, to take it a little slower, and to give him time to follow. I went over to them, and the poor rescued one being now near the shore, I helped to get him out, and to let him rest beside the other one. The pirate spirit seemed greatly delighted with his successful efforts, and very proud of himself, and was quite ready to set off again, so I sent him after someone else, whom we heard calling, and was attending to the other two when I again heard most pitiful wailings not far from me, though I could see no one at first. Then a faint, tiny speck of light, like a will-o'-the-wisp, glimmered in the darkness of that disgusting swamp, and by its light I saw someone moving about and calling for aid, so, not very willingly, I confess, I went into the mud again. When I reached the man, I found he had a woman with him, whom he was supporting and trying to encourage, and with considerable trouble I got them both out and found the pirate spirit had also arrived with his rescued one. Truly a strange group we must have made on the shore of that slimy sea, which I learned afterwards was the spiritual creation of all the disgusting thoughts, all the impure desires of the lives of men on earth, attracted and collected into this great swamp of foulness. Those spirits who were thus wallowing in it had reveled in such low abominations in their earthly lives, and had continued to enjoy such pleasures after death through the mediumship of mortal men and women, till at last even the earth plane had become too high for them by reason of their own exceeding vileness, and they had been drawn down by the force of attraction into this horrible sink of corruption to wander in it till the very disgust of themselves should work a cure. One man I had rescued had been one of the celebrated wits of Charles II's court, and after his death had long haunted the earth plane, sinking, however, lower and lower, till he had sunk into this sea, and at last the weeds of his pride and arrogance forming chains in which his feet were so entangled that he could not move till I released him. Another man had been a celebrated dramatist of the reign of the early Georges, while the man and woman had belonged to the court of Louis XV and had been drawn together to this place. Those rescued by the pirate were somewhat similar in their histories. I had been somewhat troubled at first as to how I was going to free myself from the mud of that horrible sea, but I now suddenly saw a small clear fountain of pure water spring up near to us as if by magic, and in its fresh stream we soon washed all traces of the mud away. I now advised those whom we had rescued to try what they could to do to help others in this land of darkness as a return for the help given to themselves, and having given them what advice and help I could, I started once more upon my pilgrimage. The pirate, however, seemed so very unwilling to part from me that we set forth together once more. I shall not attempt to describe all whom we sought to help in our wanderings. Were I to do so, this narrative would fill volumes, and probably only weary my readers, so I shall pass over what seemed to me like weeks of earthly time, as nearly as I am able to reckon it, and will describe our arrival at a vast range of mountains whose bleak summits towered into the night sky overhead. We were both somewhat discouraged with the results of our efforts to help people. Here and there we had found a few who were willing to listen and to be helped, but as a rule our attempts had been met with scorn and derision, while not a few had even attacked us for even interfering with them, and we had some trouble to save ourselves from injury. Our last attempt had been with a man and woman of most repulsive appearance who were fighting at the door of a wretched hovel. The man was beating her so terribly I could not but interfere to stop him, whereupon they both set on at me at once, the woman spirit doing her best to scratch my eyes out, and I was glad to have the pirate come to my assistance, for, truth to tell, the combined attack had made me lose my temper, and by doing so I put myself, for the moment, on their level, and so was deprived of the protection afforded me by my superior spiritual development. These two had been guilty of a most cruel and brutal murder of an old man, the husband of the woman, for the sake of his money, and they had been hanged for the crime, their mutual guilt forming a bond between them so strong that they had been drawn down together and were unable to separate in spite of the bitter hatred they now felt for each other. Each felt the other to be the cause of their being in this place, and each felt the other more guilty than themselves, and it had been their eagerness to each betray the other which had helped to hang them both. Now they seemed to simply exist in order to fight together, and I can fancy no punishment more awful than theirs must have been, thus linked together in hate. In their present state of mind, it was not possible to help them in any way. Shortly after leaving this interesting couple, we found ourselves at the foot of the great dark mountains, and by the aid of a curious pale phosphorescent glow which hung in patches over them, we were able to explore them a little. There were no regular pathways, and the rocks were very steep, so we stumbled up as best we might, for I should explain that by taking on a certain proportion of the condition of this low sphere, I had lost the power to rise at will and float, which was a privilege of those who had reached the land of dawn. After a toilsome ascent of one of the lower ranges of the mountains, we began to tramp along the crest of one, faintly lighted by the strange gleaming patches of phosphorescent light, and beheld on either side of us vast deep chasms in the rocks, gloomy precipices, and awful-looking black pits. From some of these came wailing cries and moans, and occasionally prayers for help. I was much shocked to think that there were spirits down in such depths of misery, and felt quite at a loss how to help them, when my companion, who had shown a most remarkable eagerness to second all my efforts to rescue people, suggested that we should make a rope from some of the great rank, withered-looking weeds and grass that grew in small crevices of these otherwise barren rocks, and with such a rope I could lower him down, as he was more used to climbing in that fashion than I, and thus we might be able to draw up some of these spirits out of their dreadful position. This was a good idea, so we set to work and soon had a rope strong enough to bear the weight of my friend. For you should know that in spiritual as well as in material things, weight is a matter of comparison, and the materiality of those low spheres will give them a much greater solidity and weight than belongs to a spirit sphere more advanced. And though to your material eyes of earth life my pirate friend would have shown neither distinct material form nor weight, yet a very small development of your spiritual faculties would have enabled you to both see and feel his presence, though a spirit the next degree higher would still remain invisible to you. Thus I am not in error, nor do I even say what is improbable when I thus speak of my friend's weight, which for a rope made of spiritual grass and weeds was as great a strain as would have been the case with an earthly man and earth materials. Having made one end of the rope fast to a rock, the spirit descended with the speed and sureness acquired by long practice as a sailor. Once there, he soon made it fast round the body of the poor helpless one whom he found lying moaning at the bottom. Then I drew up the rope and the spirit, and when he had been made safe, I lowered it to my friend and drew him up. And having done what we could for the rescued one, we went on and helped a few more like in fashion. When we had pulled out as many as we could, a most strange thing happened. The phosphorescent light died out and left us in utter darkness, while a mysterious voice floating, as it seemed, in the air, said, "Go on now, your work here is done. Those whom you have rescued were caught in their own traps, and the pitfalls that they made for others had received themselves, till that time when repentance and a desire to atone should draw rescuers to help them and free them from the prisons they had themselves made. In these mountains are many spirits imprisoned, who may not yet be helped out by any, for they would only be a danger to others were they free, and the ruin and evil they would shed around make their longer imprisonment a necessity. Yet are they prisoners of their own creating. For these great mountains of misery are the outcome and product of men's earthly lives, and these precipices are but the spiritual counterparts of those precipices of despair over which they have in earthly life driven their unhappy victims. Not till their hearts soften, not till they have learned to long for liberty, that they may do good instead of evil, will their prisons be opened, and they be drawn forth from the living death in which their own frightful cruelties to others have entombed them. The voice ceased, and alone in the darkness we groped our way down the mountainside till we reached the level ground once more, those awful, mysterious, dark valleys of eternal night, those towering mountains of selfishness and depression, had struck such a chill to my heart that I was glad indeed to know there was no call of duty for me to linger longer there. Our wandering now brought us to an immense forest, whose weird, fantastic trees were like what one sees in some awful nightmare. The leafless branches seemed like living arms held out to grasp and hold the hapless wanderer. The long snake-like roots stretched out like twisting ropes to trip him up. The trunks were bare and blackened, as though scorched by blasting breath of fire. From the bark a thick, foul slime oozed, and like powerful wax, held fast any hand that touched it. Great waving shrouds of some strange dark air plant clothed the branches like a pall, and helped to enfold and bewilder any who tried to penetrate through the ghostly forest. Faint muffled cries of those who are exhausted and half smothered came from this awful wood, and here and there we could see the imprisoned souls held captive in the embrace of these extraordinary prisons, struggling to get free, yet unable to move one single step. How, I wondered, shall we help these? Some were caught by the foot, a twisted root holding them in a vice. Another's hand was glued to the trunk of a tree. Another was enveloped in a shroud of the black moss, while yet another's head and shoulders were held fast by a couple of branches which had closed upon them. Wild, ferocious-looking beasts prowled round them, and huge vultures flapped their wings overhead, yet seemed unable to touch any of the prisoners, though they came so near. "Who are those men and women?" I asked. "They are those," was the reply, "who viewed with delight the suffering of others, those who gave their fellow men to be torn in pieces by wild beasts, that they might enjoy the excitement of their sufferings. They are those who for no reason but the lust of cruelty have, in many different ways and in many different ages, tortured and entrapped and killed those who were more helpless than themselves, and for all now here release will come only when they have learned the lesson of mercy and pity for others, and the desire to save someone else from suffering, even at the expense of suffering themselves. Then will these bands and fetters which hold them be loosed. They will be free to go forth and work out their atonement. Till then no one else can help them, none can release them. Their release must be effected by themselves, through their own merciful desires and aspirations. If you will but recall the history of your earth, and think how men in all ages have enslaved, oppressed, and tortured their fellow men in every country of that globe, you will not wonder that this vast forest should be well peopled. It was deemed right that for your own instruction you should see this fearful place, but as none of those you see and pity have so far changed their hearts that you can give them aid, you will now pass on to another region where you can do more good." After leaving the forest of desolation, we had not gone far upon our road when to my joy I saw my friend Hussein approaching. Mindful, however, of Arinzman's warning, I gave him the sign agreed upon and received the countersign in return. He had come, he said, with a message from my father and from my beloved, who had sent me what were indeed sweet words of love and encouragement. Hussein told me that my mission would now lie amongst those great masses of spirits whose evil propensities were equaled only by their intellectual powers and their ingenuity in works of evil. They are those, he said, who were rulers of men and kings of intellect in all branches, but who have perverted and abused the powers with which they were endowed till they have made of them a curse and not a blessing. With most of them, you will have to guard yourself at all points against the allurements they will hold out to tempt you, and the treachery of every kind they will practice on yourself. Yet amongst them are a few whom you are sent to succor, and whom your own instinct and events will point out as those to whom your words will be welcome and your aid valuable. I shall not in all probability bring you messages again, but some other may be sent to do so, and you must, above all things and before things, remember to distrust anyone who come to you and cannot give you the sign and symbol I have given. You are now in reality about to invade the enemy's camp, and you will find that your errand is known to them and resented, whatever it may suit them to pretend. Beware then of all their false promises, and when they seem most friendly, distrust them the most. I promised to remember and heed his warning, and he added that it was necessary I should part for a time from my faithful companion, the pirate, as he could not safely accompany me in those scenes to which my path would now lead, but he promised he would place him under the care of one who could and would help him to leave the dark country soon. After giving him loving and helpful messages to my beloved and my father, which he promised to deliver to them, we parted, and I set forth in the direction pointed out, greatly cheered and comforted by the good news and loving messages I had received. Chapter 22. Amusements in a Great City of Hell. Words of Caution. I had proceeded but a short distance when I saw a faithful friend sitting by the wayside, evidently waiting for me. I was truly glad to see him and to have found further guidance from him. We greeted one another with much cordiality. He was now, he said, appointed to accompany me during the part of my present journey, and he told me of many strange circumstances which had befallen him and which I am sure would prove to be very interesting, but as they do not properly belong to my own wanderings, I will not give any account of them here. Faithful friend took me to a tall tower, from the top of which we could see all over the city we were about to visit. This view of it beforehand being, he said, likely to prove both useful and interesting to me. We were, as I have said, surrounded always by this dark midnight sky and heavy smoke atmosphere, somewhat like a black fog, yet different and not quite so dense, since it was possible to see through it. Here and there this darkness was lighted up in some places by the strange phosphorescent light I have described, and elsewhere by the lurid flames kindled from the fierce passions of the spiritual inhabitants. When we had climbed to the top of the tall tower, which appeared to be built of black rocks, we saw lying below us a wide stretch of dark country. Heavy night clouds hung upon the horizon, and near to us lay the great city, a strange mixture of magnificence and ruin, such as characterized all the cities I saw in this dark land. A treeless blackened waste surrounded it, and great masses of dark blood-tinged vapor hung brooding over this great city of sorrow and crime. Mighty castles, lofty palaces, handsome buildings, all stamped with ruin and decay, all bared and blotched with the stains of the sinful lives lived within them, crumbling into decay, yet held together by the magnetism of their spiritual inhabitants, buildings that would last, while the links woven by their spiritual occupants' earthly lives held them in this place, and would crumble into the dust of decay whenever the soul's repentance should sever those links and suffer it to wander free. Crumble into decay, however, only to be reconstructed by another sinful soul in the shape into which his earthly life of pleasure should form it. Here there was a palace, there, beside it, a hovel. Even as the lives and ambitions of the indwelling spirits had been interwoven and blended on earth, so were their dwellings constructed here side by side. Have you ever thought, ye who dwell yet on earth, how the associates of your earthly lives may become those of your spiritual? How the ties of magnetism which are formed on earth may link your spirits and your fates together in the spirit land, so that you can only, with great difficulty and much suffering, sever them? Thus I saw in these buildings before me the proud patrician's palace, built of his ambitions and disfigured by his crimes, joined to the humble abodes of his slaves and his parasites and panderers of the earth, which had been as surely formed by their desires and disfigured by their crimes, and between which and his palace there were the same kind of links of spiritual magnetism as between himself and those who had been the sharers and instruments of his evil ambitions. He was no more able to free himself from them and their importunities than they were able to free themselves from his tyranny, till a higher and purer desire should awaken in the souls of one set or the other of them, and thus raise them above their present level. So it was that they still repeated over again their lives of earth in hideous mockery of the past, impelled thereto by that past itself, their memories presenting to them over and over again as in a moving panorama, their past acts and the actors, so that by no plunge into wild excess in the dark land could they escape the grinding of memory's millstones, till at length the last lust of skin and wickedness should be ground out of their souls. Over this great spiritual city of past earth lives hung, as I have said, patches of light of a dim, misty appearance, like faintly luminous smoke, steel gray in color. This, I was told, was the light thrown off from the powerful intellects of the inhabitants whose souls were degraded but not undeveloped, and whose intellects were of a higher order but devoted to base things, so that the true soul light was wanting, and this strange reflection of its intellectual powers alone remained. In other parts of the city, the atmosphere itself seemed on fire. The flames hung in the air, flickered from place to place, like ghostly fires whose fuel had turned to ashes ere the flames have burned out, and as the floating phantom flames were swept to and fro by the currents of the air, I saw groups of dark spirits passing up and down the streets, heedless, or perhaps unconscious, of these spectral flames that were thrown into the atmosphere by themselves, and were created by their own fierce passions, which hung around them as spiritual flames. As I looked and gazed upon the strange city of dead and ruined souls, a strange wave of feeling swept over me, for in its crumbling walls, its disused buildings, I could trace a resemblance to the one city on earth with which I was most familiar, and which was dear to my heart since I had been one of her sons, and I called aloud to my companion to ask what this meant. What was this vision I beheld before me? Was it the past, or the future, or the present of my beloved city? He answered, "It is all there. There, before you now, are the buildings and spirits of its past, such, that is, as have been evil, and there among them are buildings half finished, which those who are dwelling there now are forming for themselves. As these dwellings of past are, so shall these half-finished buildings be in the days to come, when each who builds now shall have completed his or her life work of sin and oppression. Behold and look upon it well, and then go back to earth a messenger of warning to sound in ears of your countrymen the doom that awaits so many. If thy voice shall echo in even one heart, and arrest the building of but one of these unfinished houses, you shall have done well, and your visit here would be worth all that it may cost you. Yet that is not the only reason for your coming, for you and me. Oh, my friend, there is work even in this city. There are souls whom we can save from their darkened lives, who will go back to earth, and with trumpet tongues proclaim in the ears of men the horrors of the retribution they have known, and from which they would save others. Bethink you how many ages have passed since the world was young, and how much improvement there has been in the lives and thoughts of the men who dwell upon it. And shall we not suppose that even ordinary reason might admit it must naturally be due to the influence of those who have returned to earth to warn others from the precipice over which themselves had fallen in all the pride and glory and lust of sin? Is it not a far nobler idea to place before men the idea that God sends these children, sinful and disobedient once, if you will, but repentant now, back to earth as ministering spirits to war and help strengthen others who struggle yet in the unregenerated sinfulness of their lower natures, rather than believe that he would doom any to helpless misery of eternal punishment? You and I have both been sinners beyond pardon, some of the good earth might have said, yet we have found mercy in our God even after the 11th hour, and shall not even those also know hope? If they have sunk lower than we, shall we therefore, in our little minds, set limits to the heights to which they may yet climb? No, perish the thought that such horrors as we have looked upon in these hells could be eternal. God is good, and his mercy is beyond any man's power to limit. We descend now from the tower and enter the city. In one of the large squares, with whose earthly counterpart I was very familiar, we found quite a large crowd of dark spirits assembled, listening to some sort of proclamation. Evidently it was one which excited their derision and anger, for there were yells and hoots and cries resounding on all sides, and as I drew yet more near, I perceived it was one which had been read recently in the earthly counterpart, and had for its object the further liberation and advancement of the people. an object which down here in this stronghold of oppression and tyranny only provoked a desire for its suppression, and these dark beings around me were vowing themselves to thwart the good purpose as far as lay in their power. The more men were oppressed, and the more that they quarreled and fought against oppression with violence, the stronger were these beings here below to interfere in their affairs and to stir up strife and fighting among them. As I stood watching the crowd, faithful friend drew my attention to a group of spirits who were pointing over at us and evidently meditated addressing us. "I shall go," said he, "for a few moments and leave you to speak with them alone. It will be better to do so, for they may recognize me as having been here before, and I would wish you to see them by yourself. I shall not, however, be far away, and will meet you again later when I see that I can help you by doing so. At this moment something tells me to leave you for a little." As he spoke, he moved away, and the dark spirits drew near to me with every gesture of friendliness. I thought it as well to respond with politeness, though in my heart I felt the most violent repugnance to their company. They were so repulsive-looking, so horrible in their wicked, leering ugliness. One touched me on the shoulder, and as I turned to him, with a dim sense of having seen him before, he laughed a wild, horrid laugh and cried out, "I hail thee, friend, who I see does not so well remember me as I do thee, though it was upon the earth plane we met before. I, as well as others, then sought hard to be of service to thee, only thou wouldst have none of our help, and played us, methinks, but a scurvy trick instead. None of the less for this, we, who are as lambs, didst thou but know us, have forgiven thee." Another also drew near, leering in my face with a smile perfectly diabolical, and said, "So ho, you are here after all, friend, in this nice land with us. Then surely you must have done something to merit the distinction. Say whom you have killed or caused to be killed, for none are here who cannot claim at least one slain by them, while many of us can boast of a procession as long as the ghosts that appeared to Macbeth, and others again, our most distinguished citizens, count their slain by hundreds. Did you kill that one after all? Ha ha ha!" And he broke into such a wild, horrible peal of laughter that I turned to fly from them, for like a flash had come across my mind the memory of that time when I too could have been almost a murderer, and I recognized in these horrible beings those who had surrounded me and counseled me how to fulfill my desire, how to wreak my vengeance. Even though no earthly form was still mine, I recoiled from them, but they had no thought to let me go. I was here, drawn down, as they hoped, at last, and they sought to keep me with them, that I might afford them some sport, and that they might avenge themselves upon me for their former defeat. I read their minds in this thought, though outwardly they were crowding around me with every protestation of heartly friendliness. For a moment I was at a loss what to do. Then I resolved to go with them and see what they intended, watching at the same time for the first opportunity to free myself from them. I therefore suffered them to take me by an arm each, and we proceeded towards a large house on one side of the square, which they said was theirs, and where they would have the pleasure of introducing me to their friends. Faithful friend passed close to us, and looking at me, impressed the warning, "Consent to go, but beware of entering into any of their enjoyments or allowing your mind to be dragged down to the level of theirs." We entered and passed up a wide staircase of grayish stone, which, like all things here, bore the marks of stains of shame and crime. The broad steps were broken and imperfect, with holes here and there large enough, some of them, to let a man through into the black dungeon-like depths beneath. As we passed up, I felt one of them give me a sly push, just as we were stepping over one of these, and had I not been watching for some such trick, I might have tripped up and pushed in. As it was, I simply drew aside, and my too officious companion narrowly escaped tumbling in himself, whereat the rest all laughed, and he scowled savagely at me. I recognized him just then as the one whose hand had been shriveled in the silver ring of fire drawn around my darling on the occasion when her love had drawn me to her and saved me from yielding to these dark fiends. The spirit held his hand carefully hidden under his black cloak, yet I could see through it, and I beheld the shriveled hand and arm, and knew then that I might indeed beware of its owner. At the top of the staircase we passed into a large magnificent room, lighted up by a glare of fire, and hung around with dark draperies, which were in perfect rags and tatters, and all splashed with crimson stains of wet blood, as though this had been the scene of not one, but many murders. Around the rooms were placed ghostly phantoms of ancient furniture, ragged, dirty, and defaced, yet retaining in them a semblance to an earthly apartment of great pretensions to splendor. This room was filled with the spirits of men and women. Such men, and alas, such women. They had lost all that could ever have given them any claim to the charms and privileges of their sex. They were worse to look upon than the most degraded, bedraggled specimens to be seen in an earthly slum at night. Only in hell could women sink to such an awful degradation as these. The men were to the full as bad, or even, if possible, worse, and words utterly fail me to describe them, were it indeed advisable to do so. They were eating, drinking, shouting, dancing, playing cards, and quarreling over them. In short, going on in such a way as the worst and lowest scenes of earthly dissipation can but faintly picture. I could see a faint reflection of the earthly lives of each, and knew that each and all of them, men and women alike, had been guilty, not only of shameless lives, but also of murder from one motive or another. On my left was one who had been a duchess in the days of the 16th century, and I beheld that in her history she had from jealousy and cupidity poisoned no less than 6 persons. Beside her was a man who had belonged to the same era, and had caused several persons obnoxious to him to be assassinated by his bravos, and had moreover slain another with his own hand in a most treacherous manner during a quarrel. Another woman had killed her illegitimate child because it stood between her and wealth and position. She had not only been many years in this place and seemed more overcome by shame and remorse than any of the others, so I resolved, if possible, to get near to and speak to her. My entrance was greeted with great shouts of laughter and wild applause, while half a dozen or so of the eager hands took hold of me and dragged me to the table, whereupon there were cries, "Let us drink to the damnation of this our new brother. Let us baptize him with a draught of this our new brother. Let us baptize him with a draught of this fine, cooling wine." And before I well realized their intentions, they were all waving their glasses aloft amidst yells and shouts and horrible laughter, whilst one, seizing a full glass of the fiery liquid, tried to throw it over me. I had just presence of mind enough to step lightly aside, so that the liquor was nearly all spilt upon the floor, and only a small portion fell upon my robe, which it scorched and burned like vitriol, when the wine itself turned into a bluish flame, such as one sees with lighted whiskey, and disappeared at last with an explosion of gunpowder. Then they put before me a tray of full dishes, which at first sight resembled earthly delicacies, but on closer inspection I saw they were full of the most horrible, corrupt, and loathsome maggots. As I turned away from them, one hag of a woman, for she was much more old and ugly and horrible to look upon than the most degraded specimen you can imagine, whose bleared eyes and fiendish expression made me recoil from her, seized me round the neck and tried, with many grimaces, which she intended for coquettish smiles — she had been, O ye powers, a great beauty on earth — to induce me to join her and the party in a little game of cards. She said, "The stakes for which we would play consist of the liberty of the loser. We have invented this pleasing mode of passing our time here, since it revives us for the divertissements of the past, and because there is no money here which one can win, or use if you win, seeing it all turns to dross in your hands. We have adopted this mode of paying our debts, and we agree to be the slave of anyone who beats us at our games of chance and skill, till we can turn the tables on them by ourselves winning and making them in turn our slaves. 'Tis a charming arrangement, as you would find did you join our party for a little. These others here," she added, with a strange mixture of insolent arrogance and animosity in her tone, "these others are here, but the canaille, the scum of the place, and you do well to turn from them and their amusements. But for me, I'm a royal duchess, and these, my friends, are all noble also, and we would adopt you, who are also, I perceive, one of the elite among ourselves." With the air of a queen, she signed me to be seated beside herself, and had she been a few degrees less horrible, I might have been tempted to do so, if only from my curiosity to see what their game would be like. But disgust was too strong in me, and I shook myself free of her, as well I could, saying, which was true, that cards never possessed any attraction for me. I was bent on getting near the woman I wished to speak to, and very soon an opening in the crowd allowed me to do so. As soon as I got beside her, I addressed her in a low voice and asked if she was sorry for the murder of her child, and would she wish to leave this place, even though it would be a long and sad and suffering road that would take her from it. How her face brightened as I spoke, how eagerly she faltered out, "What do you mean?" "Be assured," I said, "I mean well to you, and if you will watch and follow me, I shall doubtless find some means for us both to leave this dreadful place." She pressed my hand in an assent, for she did not venture to speak, for the other spirits were again crowding around us in a way that was rapidly growing more and more threatening, although the guise of friendliness was still kept up. The Duchess and her party had returned to their cards with a frightful avidity. They were quarreling over them and accusing each other of cheating, which I have no doubt was the case, and it seemed as though a fight was about to begin in that corner of the room to vary the monotony of their existence. I noticed also that the others were collecting in groups round the door so as to keep me from leaving in case I desired to do so, and I saw my enemy, with the withered hand, whispering with some of the others, very low, degraded type, such as might have been slaves in their past lives. Half a dozen men and women came up and urged me to join in a dance they were indulging in, which was like some of those abominations we read of in descriptions of the witches' Sabbaths of the old days of witchcraft, and which I shall certainly not attempt further to describe. Can it be, I thought to myself as I looked at them, that there was truth in these old tales after all? And can the explanation be that these unfortunate beings, who were accused as witches, did really allow themselves to be so dominated by evil spirits that their souls were for a time drawn down to one of these spheres, and took part in some of its frightful orgies? I know not, but there seems truly a marvelous resemblance between these things I was now witnessing and what was related by the so-called witches, most of them poor half-witted mortals more to be pitied than condemned. As these creatures, whose gestures it were an insult to call dancing, approached, I saw that they were trying to get behind us in a ring and surround us, and some instinct seemed to tell me not to allow them. I drew back close to the wall, holding the woman's hand in mine and whispering to her not to leave go of me on any account. The whole crowd of spirits were now gathering towards my end of the room, the dull ferocity of their faces and wild savage glitter of their eyes in terrible contrast to their affection of light-hearted gaiety. Closer and closer they gathered, a moving mass of evil personified. For once their quarrels and jealousies merged in their common desire to do me harm, to get me down and trample me and rend me to pieces. As the muttering of a storm came here and there, broken, disjointed words of hate and menace, while those dancing demons kept up their wild antics in front of us. All at once a great cry, a yell of fury broke from them. "A spy! A traitor! An enemy has got amongst us! It is one of the accursed brothers from above, come here to spy upon us and carry away our victims. Down upon him! Stamp upon him! Crush him to death! Tear him to pieces! Hurl him into the vaults below! Away with him! Away!" Like as an avalanche sweeps down a mountainside, they rushed upon us, those raging fiends, and I, for one, thought we were done for, and could not but regret that I had been drawn into entering the place at all. I thought I was lost, when lo, just as the nearest of them were actually upon us, the wall behind opened, and faithful friend and another spirit drew us through, the wall closing again so suddenly that the yelling crowd scarce realized how we had disappeared. Once outside, we were borne away to a short distance, whence, looking back, we could see through the walls, which had become transparent to our eyes, the whole mass of spirits quarreling and fighting with each other like so many devils, each blaming the others that we had been allowed to escape. "Look now," said faithful friend, "had you allowed yourself to join, even for a moment, in any of their pursuits, we should not have been able to help you, for you would have become clothed, for a time, with their material magnetism, and these walls would have held you, like them, prisoner, since you would have become too gross to pass through them. Those spirits have not done with you yet, and you must look to seeing them again, for even the brief time upon the earth plane during which you yielded to their influence and thought of following their suggestions has created a link between you and them
which will be difficult to sever till you yourself stand on a height of spiritual development which will set a gulf between you. As yet, I am told, you have not fully overcome your own passions. You have learned to subdue and control them, but all desires for revenge upon those who wronged you in the past is not dead. Until that is so, you will not be able to shake yourself entirely free from these beings, especially while you are in your own particular sphere, where they indeed are strong. For my part, I have fought a battle not unlike that which you wage now, and I know none better. How hard it is to forgive where we have been deeply wronged. Yet I know also that you will do it thoroughly and freely some day, and then will these dark spirits have lost power to cross your path. My directions are now to guide you to the palace of one you will be surprised to see, for he is one whose name is familiar to you, though he lived on earth long before your time. You have felt surprise at finding how these little beings here are able to disguise from you their real spiritual state. Know then that you owe this power of clear and pure vision to her whose pure love flows ever to you as a constant stream of crystal water, giving you the power to perceive higher things and a perception of these lower spirits in all their foulness. Between yourself and your beloved one there is now so strong a link that you unconsciously partake of the powers of her higher nature, even as she shall partake of the strength of yours, and thus, though, to yourself, in your own present state of spiritual development, much of the corruption of this place might be glossed over by the art of these dark beings, yet in the clearer, purer perception you draw from her, you possess a power to perceive things as they truly are and must appear to a pure spirit beholding them. Thus, the glamour of deception is thrown over your senses in vain. Great, then, is her love in its protecting power for you, and truly was I told that her love would be as a shield to you, my friend, in all your trials. Before we leave this sphere, I am to show you another picture that will, I fear, sadden even while it instructs you, and that is the picture of one such as you would have been without her love, left to battle alone with the hopeless burden of your sins and passions, able to see only as far as your own unaided powers from vision could show you, and deprived of all that wellspring of purity and love that ever flows to you from her. When your journey in this place is over, you are to follow me to a spot where you will see this other picture, and we know the sight will make you doubly tender and considerate to those unhappy men whom you can help better than any, since you will know that but for her saving love you must have sunk like them, and in the fullness of your gratitude we know you will seek to do for others what has been done for yourself. As he ceased to speak, we turned away from the spot silently together, my heart too full for me to answer him in any words. We had left the poor woman in the care of a bright angel of the upper spheres, and were assured she would have every help given her to progress.
Chapter 23. The Palace of My Ancestors. False Brothers Baffled. On the outskirts of the town we came to a magnificent palace, also most strangely familiar and yet unfamiliar to my eyes. In wandering through this city I was so reminded of its earthly devil that I felt as one who sees some familiar beloved spot in a nightmare vision which has distorted and rendered hideous all that he deemed so fair. I had oftentimes in my youth gazed up at this beautiful palace and taken pride to myself that I came of the race who had once owned it, and all its broad lands, and now, here, to behold it thus, with all its beauties tarnished, its marble stained and mildewed, its terraces and statues broken and defaced, its fair front marred with the black cobwebs of past crimes and wrongs done within its walls, and its lovely gardens a dreary, blackened waste, as though the breath of a pestilence had swept over it, sent through me a thrill of sorrow and dismay, and it was with a saddened heart I followed my friend into the interior. Up its great broad stairways we passed, and through the handsome doors which opened of themselves to admit us. Around us were many dark spirits flitting to and fro. Each and all seemed to expect and welcome us, as guests whose coming was awaited. At the last door, faithful friend once again left me, saying he would rejoin me in another place.
A great blaze of ruddy light greeted my eyes as this last door opened, and seemed as though someone had opened the door of a furnace, so hot and stifling was the atmosphere. At first I almost deemed the palace on fire. Then, by degrees, the blaze of light died down to a dull red glow, and a wave of steel-gray mist swept through the hall instead, while a wind, as of ice, froze the blood at my heart and seemed to impart its icy chill. These strange waves of heat and cold were caused by the intense fire of passion and the cold, selfish chill of the dual nature of the man who reigned here as prince. To the most fierce, insatiable passions he united an intense selfishness and an intellect of the highest order. As these swayed him in turn in his earthly life, causing strange alternations of fiery passion and cool calculation in his conduct, so did these, as waves thrown off by his spirit, cause in this his spiritual mansion these extraordinary variations of intense heat and extreme cold, that knew no medium of temperature in between. As he had dominated all men on earth who came within range of his power, so did he dominate the spiritual beings around him now, and rule as absolutely over them as he had ruled over his earthly subjects. At the top of this great hall I beheld him seated in his chair of state, which had around it all but imperial insignia. His walls were hung with the semblance of ancient tapestry, but how more than merely faded and ragged it looked. It was as though the thoughts and the life and the magnetism of the man had become woven into those ghostly hangings and had corrupted them with his own corruption. Instead of pictures of the chase of floating nymphs and crowned sea gods, there was a constant shifting panorama of this man's past life in all its hideousness and nakedness, thrown like pictures from a magic lantern upon the stately, moldering, ragged arras drapery behind and around him. The great windows through which the light of day never shone were hung up with the semblance of what had on earth been handsome velvet curtains, but which now appeared as some funeral pall shrouding the skeleton shapes that lurked like avenging specters within them, spectral forms of those victims whom this man had sacrificed to his lust and ambition. Great drinking cups of silver that seemed of a white heat when you touched them, and huge costly vases adorned the tables, and here, as elsewhere, there was the same hideous phantom of a feast, the same bitter mockery of earthly pleasure. At my entrance, the lord of this horrid place rose from his throne to greet me with welcoming words, and I recognized with a thrill of horror that he was the spiritual counterpart of that ancestor of my family from whom we had all been so proud to think we were descended, and whose portraits I had often been told I much resembled. The same man, the same haughty, handsome features, with doubt, but how subtle, how awful was the change upon them, the brand of shame and dishonor stamped on every line, the corruption showing through the mask with which he still strove to cover it. Here in hell all men are seen as they are, and no power can avail to hide one atom of their vileness, and this man was vile indeed. Even in an age of sensuality he had been distinguished for his sins, and in an age when men thought but little of cruelty he had shown as one without pity or remorse. I saw it all now mirrored in those pictures around him, and I felt overwhelmed to think that there could have been points of resemblance in any sort between us. I shuddered at the false, empty pride of those who had gloried in saying they were allied to such a man, simply because he had in his day wielded almost regal power, and this man spoke to me now as one in whom he had an interest, since I was of his race. He told me he welcomed me here, and would that I should dwell with him by the mysterious link that earthly relationship gave. He had attached himself to my earth life, and had from time to time been able to influence it. When I had felt most of ambition and proud desire to rise and be again one with the great ones of earth, as had been my ancestors in the past, then had he been drawn up to me, and had fed and fostered my pride and my haughty spirit that was in a sense akin to his own. And it was he told me, who had prompted those acts of my life of which I felt now the most ashamed, acts that I would have given all my life to undo after I had done them. And it was he said, who had from time to time sought to raise me in the world till I should be able to grasp power of some kind and reign a king in the field of intellect, if I could not reign a king in the country as he had done. Through me he had hoped himself
again to wield power over men, which should be some compensation for his banishment in this place of darkness and decay. "Ugh!" he cried. "This is a charnel house of moldering bones and dead skeletons. But now that you are come to see me, we shall see if we cannot, combined, do something to make ourselves feared, if not obeyed, by the dwellers of earth. I have had many a disappointment in you, O son of our noble race, and I feared you would escape me at last. I have tried for years to draw you down, but was ever baffled by some unseen power. Once and again, when I deemed I had beyond all doubt made all things sure, you would shake me off and break away from all control, till I had well nigh abandoned the struggle. But I do not yield readily to anyone, and when I could not be with you myself, I sent some of my henchmen to do you service. Ho, ho, service, yes, service, and so here you are at last, and by my faith you shall not again leave me. Behold how fair are the pleasures I have prepared for you." He took my hand. His seemed as though burning with more than the fire of fever, and led me to a seat beside himself. I hesitated, then resolved to sit down and see this adventure out, but prayed in my heart to be kept safe from temptation. I noticed he did not offer me wine or food. His instinct and knowledge told him I should only despise them, but he caused a most lovely strain of music to sound in my ears that had so long been deprived of the solace of that heavy art which ever appealed most strongly to my senses. A wild, weird, sensuous strain, such as a siren might have sung when she sought to lure her victims, swelled, died away, and rose again. No music of the earth could have been at once so beautiful and so horrible, could at the same time intoxicate and inflame the brain and heart, and yet fill my soul with so intense a feeling of fear and repugnance. And then before us rose a great black mirror in which I saw reflected the earth and its life, and myself swaying the minds and the thoughts of thousands through the fevered fascinations of such music which I could make mine, and through its spell waken the lowest yet most refined passions, till those who heard should lose themselves and their souls under its potent witchery. Then he showed me armies and nations dominated to ambitious ends by himself and his influence, so that he should reign again as a despot through the organism of an earthly tyrant. Here too, he said, I should share his power. Again, I saw the power in intellect and in literature, which I could control and influence through the imaginative, descriptive faculties of mortals who, under my prompting, would write such books as appealed to the reason, the intellect, and the sensual passions of mankind, until the false glamour thrown over them should cause men to view with indulgence and even approval the most revolting ideas and the most abominable teachings. He showed me picture after picture illustrating how man on earth could be used by spirits who possessed sufficient willpower and knowledge as mere tools through which to satisfy their lust for power and sensual enjoyments of every sort. Much of this I had known before, but I had never fully realized the vast extent of the mischief possible to such a being as the one before me, were it not for the checks imposed upon him by those higher powers whose wills are as strong as his. Them he only knows as an unseen force opposed to him, which baffles his efforts at every turn, unless he can find in man a medium of so congenial a nature that they can truly work together as one. Then, indeed, do sorrow and devastation follow in their train, and then do we see such monsters of triumphant wickedness as have disgraced the annals of all times. Now, thank heaven, these are growing fewer and farther between, as the human race and the spirit spheres become purified through the teachings of angels of celestial spheres. Last of all, there appeared before us a woman's form of such surpassing loveliness, such seductive charm, that for one instant I arose to look more closely at her and see if she could be real, and at that moment there came between me and the black magic mirror the mist-like form of an angel with the face of my beloved. And beside her this woman seemed so coarse and material and revolting to me that the momentary illusion of the senses was gone, and I knew her for what she was. What all her kind in truth, sirens that betray and ruin and drag men's souls to hell, while they themselves are all but soulless. This revulsion of feeling in myself caused the waves of magnetic ether on which the music and these images were borne to us to waver and break and vanish, leaving me alone with my tempter once more, with his voice sounding in my ears, pointing out to me how all these delights might still be enjoyed by me if I would but join him and be his pupil. But his words fell upon deaf ears. His promises allured me not. In my heart was only a horror of all these things, only a wild longing to free myself from his presence. I rose and turned from him and sought to go forth, but found I could not move one step. An invisible chain held me fast, and with a derisive laughter of rage and triumph he called out to me ironically, "Go, since thou wilt have none of my favors or promises. Go forth now and see what awaits you." I could not move one step, and began to feel a strange alarm creeping over me and a strange numbness of limbs and brain. A mist seemed to gather round and enfold me in its chill embrace, while phantom forms of awful shape and giant size drew near and yet more near. Oh, horror! They were my own past misdeeds, my own evil thoughts and desires, which had been prompted by this very man beside me, and which, nestling in my heart, had formed those links between us that held me to him now. A wild, fierce, cruel laugh broke from him at my discomfiture. He pointed to these weird shapes and bid me see what I was, who thought myself too good for his company. Darker and darker grew the hall, and wave on wave the grim phantoms crowded round us, growing each more black and fearful as they gathered, hemming me in on every side, while below our feet opened a great vault or pit, in which I saw, or seemed to see, a seething mass of struggling human forms. My fearful ancestors shook in wild paroxysms of rage and fiendish laughter, and pointing to the gathering phantoms bid them hurl me into the black pit. But suddenly, above me in the darkness gleamed a star, and from it fell a ray of light like a rope, which I grasped with both my hands, and as the folds of light diffused themselves around me, I was drawn up, out of the dark place, away from that fearful palace. When I recovered from my astonishment and relief at my release, I found myself in the open country with faithful friend, and no less a spirit than my Eastern guide himself making passes over me, for I was much shaken and exhausted with the struggle. My guide in the most kind and tender manner addressed me, and he told me he had permitted this trial in order that my knowledge of the true nature of the man I had just left should be my best protection in future against his wiles and schemes for my enslavement. "So long," he said, "as you thought of this man with pride or respect as an ancestor and one who had any ties to you, so long would his power to influence you continue, but now your own sense of horror and repugnance will act as a repelling power to keep his influence away from you. Your will is quite as strong as his, and you did you but know it, need no other protection. In the interview just past, you allowed your senses to be beguiled, and your will paralyzed by this dark being before you were aware, and thus I had not rescued you, he might, though for a time only, have made you subject to him, and while you were so, have done you serious injury. Take heed now, while you yet remain in his sphere, that you do not again lose the sovereignty over yourself, which is your own, and which no man can usurp, unless your wavering will allows him to do so. I leave you again, my son, to follow still your pilgrimage, which will soon, however, draw to its close, and I bid you be of good cheer, since your reward shall come from her whom you love, and who loves you, and sends ever her most tender thoughts to you." He was gone as mysteriously as he had come, and faithful friend and I set out once more to see what experiences we would meet with farther on. I was speculating what our next adventure would be when a couple of spirits hurried up to us with a great importance of manner and asked if we were not members of the Brotherhood of Hope, since, if so, they had a message for one of us from a dearly loved friend on earth and were sent by one of our guides to deliver it. At first I was much pleased. I thought at once of my darling, and that they were sent from her, since they had not the appearance of most of the dark spirits around. Their robes shone with a peculiar blue-gray light that was almost like a mist clothing them, and I had some trouble to make out their faces. When I did so, I could not help starting, and a feeling of distrust crept over me, for the flickering veil of gray-blue gauze that interposed between us became at times so thin that I could see a couple of most repulsive dark spirits under it. Faithful friend quietly pressed my arm as a warning, so I addressed them with caution and asked what was their message. In the name of the prophet, began one, we were to tell you that your love is very, very ill, and prays that you return to earth to see her without delay, lest her spirit shall have passed, ere you arrive, to realms where you cannot follow her. We are to show you the way to reach her quickly. Their words gave me at first a great sense of fear. How long? I asked eagerly. Is it since you left her? Not 2 days, was the reply, and we are to bring you at once. Your Eastern guide is with her and has sent us specially. Then I knew they lied, for the Eastern guide had but just left, and he had said no word of my beloved being ill, but I temporized with them and said, give me the secret sign of our brotherhood, since, unless you do so, I am, of course, not able to go with you. The veil of gauzy mist was fast fading from them, and I could see their dark forms growing more and more distinct beneath. I did not, however, show them that I saw this, and as they did not answer at once, but were whispering to each other, I continued, if you are sent by our guide, you will surely give me the countersign of our order. Surely, yes. Certainly I can. Here it is. Hope is eternal. And he smiled with an air of great frankness. Good, I said. Go on, finish it. Finish it. Is there more you want? And he stood puzzled. The other nudged him and whispered something, whereupon he added, hope is eternal, and truth is, what, amico? Inevitable, said the other. I smiled most blandly upon them both. You are so clever, friends. No doubt you can now give me the symbol? Symbol? Diavolo. There was no symbol we were to give. Was there not? I said. Then I must be the one to give it to you. They both raised their arms to make a grab at me. I saw one had a withered hand, and knew at once whom I was indebted for this little plot. As they rushed upon me, I stepped back and made the sign of the sacred symbol of truth in all ages and to all words. At the sight of this, they cowered down upon the earth as though I had struck them and rendered them unconscious. There we left them to ruminate at their leisure. I asked faithful friend as we moved away what he thought they would do now. In a short time, he said, they will recover. You have given them a shock, and for the moment stunned them, but they will be up after us again ere long with some fresh devilment they will have hatched. If you had gone with them, they would have led you into the morass yonder and left you to wander about half-choked, if they did you no more serious harm. You must ever remember that they have great power in their own sphere if once you give yourself up to their guidance in any sense. Chapter 24. The Story of Benedetto. Plotters again baffled. Faithful friend now proposed to me that we should visit one more city in this strange land, in order that I might see the man whose fate might have been my own, but for the constancy and love which has so helped and sustained me. Our earthly histories were in some respects different, but there were some points of resemblance both in that and in our dispositions, which would make the sight of this man and the knowledge of his history useful to me, while at a future time I might be able to help him. It is now more than 10 years, he said, since this man passed from earth, and it is only lately that he has begun to wish to progress. I found him here on my former visit to this place and was able to assist him a little, and finally to enroll him as one of our brotherhood, and I am now told that he is shortly to leave this sphere for a higher one. I assented to the proposed journey, and after a short but very rapid flight, we found ourselves hovering over a wide lagoon upon whose dark bosom there floated a great city, its towers and palaces rising from the waters and reflected in them as in a mirror of black marble veined with dark red lines that somehow made me feel they were streams of blood flowing through it. Overhead there hung the same dark pall of cloud, lighted by patches of steel gray and fiery red floating vapor, which I had noticed in the other city. The appearance of this place suggested to me that we must be about to enter the Venice of these lower spheres, and on my saying so to faithful friend, he answered, yes, and you will find here many celebrated men, whose names were written on the history of their times in letters of fire and blood. We now found ourselves in the town and proceeded to pass through its principal canals and squares in order that I might see them. Yes, there they were, these degraded counterparts of all those beautiful places made familiar by the brush of artist and the fame of those who have carved for themselves a niche in the temple of history. There flowed the canals, seeming like dark crimson streams of blood flowing from some vast shambles, washing and rippling up the marble steps of the palaces to leave there a thick, foul stain. The very stones of the buildings and pavements seemed to me to ooze and drip blood. The air was thick with its red shade. Deep down below the crimson waters I saw the skeleton forms of countless thousands who had met their deaths by assassination or more legalized forms of murder, and whose bodies had found sepulture beneath the dark waves. Below, in the dungeons, which honeycombed the city, I beheld many spirits crowded together, and like caged wild beasts, the ferocity of the cruel tiger in their gleaming eyes, and the vindictive malice of the chained human tyrant in every attitude of their crouching figures. Spirits whom it was needful to thus confine, since they were more ferocious than savage animals. Processions of city magistrates, and their attendants, haughty nobles with their motley following of soldiers and seamen and slaves, merchants and priests, humble citizens and fishermen, men and women of all ranks and all times passed to and fro, and nearly all were alike degraded and repulsive looking. And as they came and went, it seemed to me as if skeleton hands, phantom arms, rose through the stones of the pavements from the dungeons beneath, striving to draw these others down to share their own misery. There was a haunted look on many of their faces, and black care seemed to sit behind them continually. Far out in the waters of the lagoon, spectral galleys floated, filled with slaves chained to their oars, but amongst them there were no longer the helpless victims of political intrigue or private revenge. These beings were the spirit of those who had been the hard taskmasters, the skillful plotters who had consigned many to this living death. Yet farther out at sea I could behold the great ships, and nearer at hand, in the ruined harbor, there were more spiritual counterparts of those piratical craft of the Adriatic, filled with the spirits of their piratical crews, who had made plunder and rapine on the war their delight, and who now spent their time battling with one another and making forays upon others like themselves. Spectral-looking gondolas floated upon the waterways of the city, filled with spirits bent upon following still the occupations and pleasures of their former lives. In short, in this Venice, as in other cities I had seen, there existed a life akin to that of the earth, save that from this place all the good and pure and true, all the real patriots and unselfish citizens were gone, and only the evil left to prey upon each other and act as avenging spirits to their companions in crime. Seated upon the parapet of one of the small bridges, we found a man wearing the dress of the Brothers of Hope, a dark gray robe such as I had myself worn in the earlier stages of my wanderings. His arms were folded upon his breast, and his face was so far concealed by the hood that we could not see his features, but I knew at once that this was the man we had come to see, and I likewise recognized his identity as that of a celebrated Venetian painter whom I had known in my youth, though not very intimately. We had not met again, and I was ignorant that he had passed from earth till I saw him sitting thus upon the bridge in this city of hell. I confess the recognition gave me somewhat of a shock, recalling as it did those days of my youth when I was a student of art, with all the fairest prospects in life, as it would seem, before us, and now to see him and to think what his life must have been to bring him to this pass. He did not see us, so faithful friend proposed that we should turn aside for a little while. He told me the spirit's history, and then we could approach together and speak to him. It seemed that this man, whom I shall call by his spirit name of Benedetto, since his earthly life is better to be forgotten, had risen rapidly into fame after I knew him, and had been fairly successful in selling his pictures. But Italy is not a rich country, and Benedetto's most wealthy patrons were the English and Americans who came to visit Venice, and at the house of one of them, Benedetto met the woman who was to overshadow his whole life with her baneful influence. He was young, handsome, talented, highly educated, and of an ancient, though poor family, and therefore naturally received by all the best society in Venice. It was to a lady who belonged to the higher ranks of this social sphere that Benedetto lost his heart, and dreamed in his youthful and romantic foolishness that she would be content to become the wife of a struggling artist with nothing but his brains and a growing reputation. The lady was scarce 20 when they first met, very beautiful, perfect alike in face and form, and endowed with all the charms which can enslave the heart of a man. And she encouraged Benedetto in every way, so that, poor youth, he believed her love to be as sincere as his. But with all the passionate thirst of her nature for admiration and love, she was cold, calculating, ambitious, and worldly, incapable of either understanding or returning such a love as she inspired in a nature like Benedetto's, which knows love or hate only in extremes. She was flattered by his attentions, charmed by his passionate devotion, and proud of having made conquest of one so handsome and so gifted, but she had no idea of sacrificing anything for his sake, and even when she was most tender, most alluring to him, she was striving with all her arts to become the wife of a middle-aged Venetian nobleman, whose wealth and position she coveted, even while she despised the man himself. The end of Benedetto's dream came all too soon. He ventured to lay his heart and all his prospects at the feet of his inamorata, putting into her ears all the love and devotion of his soul. And she? Well, she received it all very coolly, told him not to be a fool, explained to him how impossible it was that she could do without money and position, and, in fine, dismissed him with a calm indifference to his sufferings which nearly drove him mad. He fled from Venice, went to Paris, and there plunged into all the dissipations of that gay capital, striving to bury the recollection of his unfortunate passion. They did not meet for some years, and then Benedetto's fate took him back to Venice once more, cured, as he hoped, and prepared to despise himself for his folly. He had now become famous as a painter, and could almost command his own price for his pictures. He found that the lady had duly married the Marchese, and was reigning as a society beauty and a queen of fashion, surrounded by a crowd of admirers, whom she did not always feel it necessary to introduce to her husband. Benedetto had resolved to treat the lady with cool indifference should they meet, but this was not her intention. Once her slave, always so. No lover should dare to break her chain till she chose to dismiss him. She devoted herself once more to the subjugation of Benedetto's heart, and alas, that heart was only too ready to surrender when she told him, with every accent of feeling in her voice, how she regretted now the path she had chosen. Thus Benedetto became her unacknowledged lover. For a time he lived in a state of intoxication of happiness, but only for a time. The lady tired of everyone after a little. She liked fresh conquests, new slaves to do her homage. She liked excitement, and Benedetto, with his jealousy, his eternal devotion, grew tiresome, his presence wearisome. Moreover, there was another admirer, young, rich, handsome also, and the Marchesa preferred him, and told Benedetto so, gave him, in fact, his congé for the second time. His passionate reproaches, his violent protestations, his vehement anger all annoyed the lady greatly. As she grew colder, more insolent toward him, he grew more excited. He threatened, he implored, he vowed he would shoot himself if she proved false to him. And finally, after a violent scene, they parted, and Benedetto went home. When he called next day, he was told by the servant that Marchesa declined to see him again. The insolence of a message thus given him, the heartlessness of the Marchesa, the bitter shame of being a second time trifled with and flung aside like an old glove, were too much for his passionate, fiery nature, and he went back to his studio and blew out his brains. When his spirit awoke to consciousness, it was all to the horrors of finding himself a prisoner in his coffin in the grave. He had destroyed his material body, but he could not free his spirit from it, till the decaying of that body should liberate the soul. Those loathsome particles of that corrupting body still clothed the spirit. The link between them was not severed. Oh, the horror of such a fate! Can anyone hear of it and not shudder to think what the bitter weariness and discontent of life and a reckless desire to be free of it at any cost may plunge the soul into? If those on earth would be truly merciful to the suicide, they would cremate his body, not bury it, that the soul may, by the speedy dispersal of the particles, be sooner freed from such a prison. The soul of a suicide is not ready to leave the body. It is like an unripe fruit that does not fall readily from the material tree which is nourishing it. A great shock has cast it forth, but it still remains attached, till the sustaining link shall wither away. From time to time, Benedetto would lapse into unconsciousness and lose for a little the sense of his terrible position, and from these states of merciful oblivion he would awaken to find that little by little the earthly body was losing its hold upon the spirit and crumbling into dust. But while it did so, he had to suffer in all his nerves the pangs of this gradual dissolution. The sudden destruction of the earthly body, while it would have given his spirit a more violent, more painful shock, would at least have spared him the slow torture of this lingering decay. At last the material body ceased to hold the spirit, and he rose from the grave, but still hung over it, tied though he was no longer imprisoned. Then the last link snapped, and he was free to wander forth into the earthly plane. And first his powers of hearing and seeing and feeling were mostly feeble developed, then gradually they unfolded, and he became conscious of his surroundings. With these powers came again the passions and desires of his earthly life, and also the knowledge of how he could yet gratify them. And again, as in his earthly life, he sought oblivion for his sorrow and bitterness in the pleasures of the senses. But he sought in vain. Memory was ever present with him, torturing him with the past. In his soul there was a wild hunger, a fierce thirst for revenge, for power to make her suffer as he had done, and the very intensity of his thoughts at last carried him to where she was. He found her, as of old, surrounded by her little court of gay admirers, a little older, but still the same, still as heartless, still untroubled by his fate and indifferent to it. And it maddened him to think of the sufferings he had brought upon himself for the love of this woman. At last all thoughts became merged in the one thought of how he could find means to drag her down from her position, how strip her of all those things which she prized more than love or honor or even lives of those who might be called her victims. And he succeeded, for spirits have more powers than mortals dream of. Step by step, he saw her come down from her proud position, losing first wealth, then honor, stripped of every disguise she had worn, and known for what she was, a vile temptress who played with men's souls as one plays with dice, careless how many hearts she broke, how many lives she ruined, careless alike of her husband's honor and her own fair fame, so long as she could hide her intrigues from the eyes of the world and rise a step higher in wealth and power upon the body of each new victim. And even in his darkness and misery, Benedetto hugged himself and was comforted to think it was his hands that were dragging her down and tearing the mask from her beauty and worldliness. She wondered how it was that so many events all tended to one end, her ruin, how it was that her most carefully laid schemes were thwarted, her most jealously guarded secrets found out and held up to the light of day. She began at last to tremble at what each day might bring forth. It was as though some unseen agency, whose toils she could not escape, was working to crush her. And then she thought of Benedetto and his last threats that if she drove him to despair, he would send himself to hell and drag her with him. She had thought he meant to murder her, perhaps, and when she heard he had shot himself and was dead, she felt relieved and soon forgot him, save when some event would recall him to her mind for a moment. And now she was always thinking of him. She could not get away from the obtrusive thought, and she began to shudder with fear lest he should rise from his grave and haunt her. And all the time there stood Benedetto's spirit beside her, whispering in her ears and telling her that this was his revenge to come to him at last. He whispered to her of the past and of that love that had seemed so sweet and that had turned to bitterest burning hate, consuming him as with the fire of hell, whose flame should scorch her soul also and drive her to a despair as great as his. And her mind felt his haunting presence even when her bodily eyes could see nothing. In vain she fled to society, to all places where there were crowds of men and women, in order to escape. The haunting presence was with her everywhere. Day by day it grew more distinct, more real, and something from which there was no escape. At last one evening in the dim gray of twilight she saw him, with his wild, menacing eyes, his fierce, passionate hate, expressing itself in every line of his face, in every gesture of his form. The shock was too much for her overwrought nerves, and she fell dead upon the floor.
And then Benedetto knew that he had succeeded and had killed her, and that from henceforth the brand of Cain was stamped upon his brow. The horror of himself seized upon him. He loathed the deed he had done. He had intended to kill her, and then when the spirit left the body, to drag it down with him and to haunt and torment it forever, so that on neither side of the grave should she know rest. But now his only thought was to escape from himself and the horror of his success, for all good was not dead in this man, and the shock which had killed the Marchesa had awakened him to the true nature of his revengeful feelings. Then he fled from the earth down and down, even to this city of hell, the fit dwelling place for such as he. "It was in this place that I found him," said faithful friend, "and he was able to help the now repentant man and to show him how he might best undo the wrong he had done. He awaits now the coming of this woman he so loved and hated, in order that he may ask her to forgive him and that he may forgive her himself. She has also been drawn to this sphere, for her life was very guilty, and it is in this counterpart of that city which saw the history of their earthly love that they will meet again, and that is why he awaits her upon this bridge where in the past she has so often met him." "And will she meet him soon?" "Yes, very soon, and then will join the sojourn of this man in the sphere be over, and he will be free to pass to a higher one, where his troubled spirit shall at last know a season of rest ere it mounts by slow and painful steps the stony pathway of progression." "Will she too leave here with him?" "No, oh no, she will be also helped to progress, but their paths will lie wildly asunder. There was no true affinity between them, only passion and pride and wounded self-love. They will part here to meet no more." We now drew near Benedetto, and as I touched him on the shoulder, he started and turned round, but at first did not recognize me. Then I made myself known and said how I should rejoice to renew our early friendship in those higher spheres in which I hoped we would both soon meet again. I told him briefly that I, too, had sinned and suffered and was working my way upwards now. He seemed glad to see me and wrung my hand with much emotion when we said goodbye. And then faithful friend and I went away, leaving him still seated upon the bridge, waiting for his last interview with her who had once been so dear to him, who was now but a painful memory. As we were on our road from Venice to those plains which I now understood to be the spiritual replica of the plains of Lombardy, my attention was suddenly attracted by a voice calling me in a pitiful tone for help. Turning back a little way to my right hand, I saw a couple of spirits lying apparently helpless upon the ground, and one was making gestures to cause me to come to him. So, thinking it was someone in need of my help, I let my companion go on and went to see what he wanted. The spirit holding out his hand to me and murmuring something about helping him to rise, I bent down to lift him up. When, to my surprise, he made a clutch at my legs with his hands and contrived to fasten his teeth in my arm, while the other one, suddenly jumping up, tried to fasten upon my throat like a wolf. With some trouble and a good deal of anger on my part, I confess, I shook myself free of them and was stepping back when I half stumbled and, turning my head, saw what a great pit had suddenly opened behind me, into which another step backward I must have fallen. Then I remembered the warnings given me not to allow my lower passions to be aroused and thus place myself on a level with these beings, and I regretted my momentary burst of anger and resolved to keep calm and cool. I turned towards the two dark spirits again and saw that the one who I fancied had been hurt was crawling along the ground to reach me, while the other was gathering himself together like a wild beast about to spring. I fixed my eyes steadily upon the pair, whom I now recognized as the man with the withered hand and his friend, who had tried to deceive me with the false message a short time before. Steadily I looked at them, throwing all the power of my will into the determination that they should not advance nearer to me. As I did so, they faltered and stopped, and finally rolled over on the ground, snarling and showing their teeth like a couple of wolves, but unable to approach a step nearer. Leaving them, I thus hurried after a faithful friend, whom I soon overtook, and narrated to him what had occurred. He laughed and said, "I could have told you who those were, Franchezzo, but I felt it would be no harm to let you find out yourself.
and likewise learn how valuable a protection your own force of character and determination could be. You are naturally strong-willed, and so long as you do not use it to domineer over the rights of others, it is a most useful and valuable quality, and in your work in the spirit world, you will have found that it is the great lever by which you can act, not alone upon those round you, but even upon apparently inanimate matter. And I thought, as those two are very likely to come across you from time to time, you might as well settle now which should be master, which should be the dominant personality. They will be shy of directly meddling with you again, but so long as you work about the earth plane, you will find them ready at any chance to thwart your plans if the opportunity comes. Chapter 25. A Pitched Battle in Hell. We now saw before us a vast, sightly, undulating plain upon which great masses of dark spirits were moving. At Faithful Friend's suggestion, we ascended a small hillock that we might observe their movements. "We are now," said Faithful Friend, "about to witness one of the great battles that take place here between the opposing forces of dark spirits, whose delight was in war and its rapine in bloodshed, and who, here in the dark state, which is the result of their earthly cruelty and ambition, carry on yet their warlike operations against each other and contend for the supremacy of these kingdoms of hell. Behold how they are massing their forces for attack upon those others on our right, and observe the skill they will display in their maneuvers. The powerful minds of men who swayed armies on earth sway such unhappy beings here as are not strong enough to resist their spell, and thus they force these less powerful spirits to fight under their banners, whether they will nor not, just as they did with mortals on earth. You will see these powerful leaders engage in a struggle worse than deadly, since no death can come to end the contest, which they renew over and over again, as would almost seem eternally, or until, as is to be hoped, the satiety of mind of one or other of these powerful leaders will at last make him long for some nobler form of contest, some higher triumph of the soul than is won over these miserable beings in battles where victory gives only a fresh right to torture and oppress the vanquished. The same instincts and natural gifts which are now perverted to personal ambition and the lust for cruelty and domination as their only aim will, when purified, make these spirits mighty helpers where now they are destroyers, and the same powers of will help forward the progress they now retard. When this progress shall take place depends, for each, upon the latent nobility of the soul itself, the awakening of the dormant love of goodness and justice and truth to be found in all. Though like seeds in the earth, these germs of better things may lie long hidden beneath the mass of evil that overloads them, there must and does come a time for each when the better soul awakens and these germs of good send out shoots that lead to repentance and bring forth an abounding harvest of virtue and good works. We looked over the vast plain and now beheld the two mighty hosts of spirits drawn up to confront one another in the array of battle. Here and there I beheld powerful spirits leading each his band or regiment as in an earthly army. In the van of the opposing forces were two majestic beings who might have been models for Milton's Lucifer, so strong was the sense of power and high intellect with which they impressed me. In each there was a certain beauty, a grandeur of form and feature, a regal majesty even in the degradation of hell, but alas, the beauty was that of a wild, fierce tiger or lion that watches how he may rend his army in pieces and drag his prey into his den. Dark and forbidding were their countenances, cruel and ferocious, their gleaming eyes, the false smile, showing their sharp teeth like those animals of prey. The cunning of the serpent was in their looks, and the pitiless hunger of the vulture in their smile. Each rode in his chariot of war, drawn not by horses, but by the spirits of degraded men, whom they lashed forward as beasts of burden, and drove furiously on to be trampled down in the middle of melee as cattle. Wild strains of music that sounded like the shrieks of the souls of the damned, and the thunders of a mighty storm, broke from the assembled armies, and with one fell swoop they rushed forward and bore down upon each other. flying and hurrying through the air or dragging themselves along the ground, pushing, hustling, jostling, and trampling like a herd of wild animals. On they came, and as they met, their fierce cries and shouts and imprecations rent the air and made even hell more hideous. They charged and recharged, they maneuvered, marched, and countermarched, these phantom spirit armies of the dead, even as they had done in the battles of earth life. They fought and wrestled like demons, not men, for they had no weapons save those of wild beasts, their teeth and claws. If a battle with mortal weapons is horrible, this was doubly so, where they fought as wolves and tigers might, the two powerful leaders directing the mass, urging them on and guiding the fight as the tide of battle swept back one side or the other. Over all had towered these two dark regal spirits, and now no longer content to let their soldiers fight, but bent each upon the destruction of the other, they rose from the fighting mass and, soaring high above them, turned their looks upon each other with deadliest hate. Then, flying through the air with their dark robes extended behind and above them like wings, they grappled and wrestled together in a fierce struggle for supremacy. It was as though two eagles fought in mid-air, while a mass of carrion crows grubbed and fought for worms beneath them. I turned from the crows to watch the eagles and to mark how, with no weapons but their hands and their powerful wills, they fought as wild beasts do in a forest. They uttered no sound, no cry, but gripped each other with a death grip that neither would relax, and swayed to and fro in the air before us, now one upward, now the other, their fierce eyes stabbing each other with fiery darts, their hot breath scorching each other's faces, their fingers clutching at each other's throats, and both seeking for a chance to fasten on their enemy with their teeth. Backwards and forwards, up and down they swayed and writhed in what seemed to me a death struggle for both. At last, one seemed to fail. He sank below the other, who was bearing him to the ground to dash him, as I saw, over a deep precipice into a chasm in the rocks that skirted the field of the battle, a deep and dark and awful pit into which he meant to hurl the vanquished one and keep him prisoner. Fierce and long was the struggle, for the one below would not give in and clung to the other to drag him down with him, if possible. But in vain, his powers were failing fast. As they reached the black chasm and hung poised over it, I saw the uppermost one wrench himself free by a mighty effort and fling the other from him, down into those awful depths. With a shudder, I turned away and saw the battle had been raging as fiercely on the plain. Those spectral hosts had fought, and the army of the victorious general had beaten back the forces of his vanquished foe till they were broken and dispersed in all directions, leaving their disabled comrades on the field, lying as wounded men do in an earthly battle, while the victors were dragging away with them their captives to what fate I could only too well guess. Sickened and disgusted with their brutishness, I would fain have left this place, but faithful friend, touching my shoulder, said, "Now has come the time for our work, my friend. Let us descend yonder and see if there are none whom we can help. Amongst the fallen and vanquished, we may find those who are sick of war and its horrors as you, and who will be but too glad for our help." So we went down to the plain. It was as might have been a battlefield when night has fallen upon it, and there are but the wounded and the slain left behind. All other spirits had gone like a flock of evil birds to seek fresh carrion. I stood among a writhing, moaning mass of beings, and knew not where to begin my help. There were so many. It was worse, 1,000 times worse, than any mortal battlefield. I have seen the dead and dying lying in the streets of my native town, thick as fallen leaves, and my heart has ached and bled for them, and burned with shame and anger that such things could be. But even there was at least the peace and sleep of death, so often the anguish, and there was hope of helping those who yet lived. But here, in this awful hell, there seemed no hope, and no death that could relieve these suffering ones, no morning that should dawn upon the night of their miseries. If they revived, would it not be to live again this awful life, to find themselves surrounded by this awful night and these fierce wild beasts of men? I stooped down and tried to raise the head of one poor wretch who lay moaning at my feet, crushed till his spirit body seemed but a shapeless mass, and as I did so, the mysterious voice spoke in my ears and said, Even in hell there is hope, or why else are you come? The darkest hour is ever before the dawn, and for these, the vanquished and fallen, has come the hour of their change. The very cause that has made them to be thus borne down and trampled under is that which shall now raise them. The desire for higher and better things, the shrinking from evil around them, has rendered them weak in the wickedness which is the strength of hell and its inhabitants, and has made them waver and hesitate to thrust at and harm one another with the ruthless force of these other wild and worthless beings, and thus they have been borne down and vanquished, but their fall from power here will open to them the doors of a higher state, and thus shall there dawn for them the gray glimmer of a higher hope. Mourn not for them, but seek to ease their suffering, that they may sink into a sleep of death to this sphere, and wake into a new life in the sphere next above. And what, I asked, of that powerful spirit whom I saw thrown into the dark chasm? He too will be helped in time, but his soul is not yet ripe for help, and it is of no use to try till then. The voice ceased, and faithful friend who was beside me made signs to show me how to soothe these weary ones to sleep, and pointed out to me numerous stars of light which had gathered on the field of pain, and said they were carried by those of our brotherhood who were, like ourselves, drawn here on their mission of love and mercy. Ere long, writhing, moaning forms had sunk into unconsciousness, and a short time after I saw a sight that was strange and wonderful indeed. Over each silent form there arose a faint, misty, floating vapor, such as I had seen once before in the case of a spirit we had rescued, as I have already told. Gradually, these vapors took shape and solidity, and assumed the form of the released spirit or soul. Then each was borne away by bands of bright, ethereal spirits who had gathered above our heads till the last were gone, and our work and theirs was done. Chapter 26. Farewell to the Dark Land. I now perceived that those brothers of hope, who like myself had been assisting the poor wounded spirits, all belonged to the same company as myself, and they were all collecting together the little starry lights we carried, looking indeed like emblems of hope in darkness. Faithful friend and I joined the others, and were soon interchanging greetings and congratulations like a brigade of soldiers about to return home after a successful campaign. Before we again passed through the fiery ring that encompassed this region, the leader of our band conducted us to the top of a high pinnacle of rock from which we beheld the cities and plains and mountains of that land of darkness through which each of us had passed our pilgrimage. And standing on that mountain peak, we could survey the mighty panorama of hell stretched out at our feet. He then addressed us in grave, solemn tones. This scene upon which we look is but a very small, fractional portion of the great sphere which men have been wont to speak of as hell. There are dark spheres above this, which may seem to many to deserve the name until they have seen this place and learn in it how low a soul can sink, and how much more terrible in this sphere can be both the crimes and the sufferings. The great belt of dark matter which has composed this, the lowest of earth's spheres, extends for many million miles around us, and has received within its borders all those multitudes of sinful souls whose material lives have been passed on earth, and whose existences date back to the remote, far-off ages in which the planet Earth first began to bear its harvest of conscious immortals, destined to sin and suffer, and work out each their own salvation till they should be purified from all earthly stain, all taint of their lower nature. The multitudes of such lives have been, and yet shall be, as the stars of the sky in the sands of the sea in number, and as each builds for himself his own habitation in the higher or in the lower spheres, so are the vast spheres peopled, and their many dwelling places and cities formed. Far beyond the power of any mortal to carry even his thoughts lie the myriad dwelling places of the spheres, each spot or locality bearing upon it the individual stamp of the spirit whose life has created it. And as there are no two faces, no two minds exactly similar in all the countless beings that have peopled the earth, so there are no two places in the spirit world exactly alike. Each place, yea, even each sphere, is the separate creation of the particular class of minds that have created it, and those whose minds are in affinity, being drawn to each other in the spirit world, every place will bear more or less the peculiar stamp of its inhabitants. Thus, in giving a description of this or any other sphere, you will naturally be able to tell only what you have seen, and to describe those places to which you are attracted, while another spirit, who has beheld a different portion of the same sphere, may describe it so very differently that men on earth, who limit all things too much and measure them by their own standards of probability, will say that since you differ in describing the same sphere, you must both be wrong. They forgot that Rome is not Genoa, Milan, or Venice, yet these are all in Italy. Lyons is not Paris, and yet both are in France. And both will bear certain characteristic features, certain national traits of resemblance. Or to extend the simile still further, New York and Constantinople are both cities upon the planet Earth, yet there is between them and their populations so great a difference, so wide a gulf, that it requires we should look no longer for national characteristics, but only for the broad fact that both are inhabited by the human race, differing, however wildly, in manners and appearance. And now I would have you each observe that in all your wanderings, in all the sad sights you have seen, all the unhappy beings you have known groveling in this sink of their own iniquities, there were yet germs of human souls inextinguishable and undestroyable, and you have each learned, I trust, that long as may be the probation of the soul, greatly as it may retard the hour of its release by the perversion of its powers, yet to all is given the inalienable birthright of hope, and to each will come at last the hour of awakening, and those who have sunk to the lowest depths will arise, even as a pendulum swung to its farthest limit will arise and swing back again as high as it has sunk low. Bitter and awful is the reckoning the sinful soul must pay for its wild indulgence in evil, but once paid there is not again that reckoning to be met. There is no inexorable creditor whose ears are deaf to the voice of prayer, or who will say to the repentant prodigal, "Begone, for your doom is sealed, and the hour of your redemption past." O brethren of hope, can man in his littleness measure the power of the Almighty, whose ways are past his finding out? Can man put a limit to his mercy and say it shall be denied to any sorrowful sinner, however deep has been his sin? God alone can condemn, and he alone can pardon, and his voice cries out to us in everything, in every blade of grass that grows, in every ray of light that shines. How great is the goodness and mercy of our God, how long-suffering and how slow to anger. And his voice calls with that trumpet tongue, through his many angels and ministering spirits, to all who repent and seek for mercy, that mercy is given, pardon, full and free, is granted unto all who earnestly seek it and would truly labor that they may win it. Even beyond the grave, even within the gates of hell itself, there is yet mercy and pardon, yet hope and love held out to all. Not one atom of the immortal soul essence which has been breathed into man and become a living conscious individuality is ever again truly lost, wholly doomed either to annihilation or eternal misery. They err, I had almost said they sin, who teach man otherwise, for by doing so they shut a door upon his hopes and render the erring soul yet more desperate, because more hopeless, when, as he deems, death has put the final seal of damnation upon his fate. I would, when each of you returns to the earth plane, that you proclaim to all this truth which you have learned in these your wanderings, and strive ever that each and all may feel the sense of hope and the need there is to take heed to their ways while there is yet time. Far easier were it for man in his earth life to undo his misdeeds than if he wait till death has placed his barrier between him and those to whom he would atone. In those hells which you have seen, all has been the outcome of men's own evil lives, the works of their own past, either upon earth or in its spheres. There is nothing but what has been the creation of the soul itself, however horrible you may appear to its surroundings. However shocked you may have felt and the spiritual appearance of these beings, Yet must you ever remember that such as they are, have they made themselves. God has not added 1 grain's weight to the burden of any, and equally must it be the work of each to undo what he has done, to build up again what he has destroyed, to purify what he has debased. And then will these wretched dwellings, these degraded forms, these fearful surroundings be exchanged for brighter and happier scenes, purer bodies, more peaceful homes, and when at last in the fullness of time the good on earth and in its spheres shall overcome the bad, the evil sights and the evil places will be swept away as the froth upon the sea is swept on by the advancing tide, and the pure water of life shall flow over these spots and purify them till these solid black mountains, this dense heavy atmosphere, and these foul dwelling places shall melt in the strong purifying fire of repentance, even as the hard granite rock is melted in the crucible of the chemist, till it is dissipated into the atmosphere and floated away to form other rocks elsewhere. Nothing is ever lost, nothing ever destroyed. All things are imperishable. These atoms which your body has attracted to it today are thrown off again tomorrow, and pass on to form other bodies eternally, as these emanations of men's spiritual natures are formed into the earth's spheres. And when there is no longer magnetism sufficiently gross to hold together these gross particles which form the lower spheres, these atoms will become detached from following the earth and its sphere in their rushing journey through the limitless ether of space, and will float in suspension in the ether till drawn to another planet whose spheres are congenial and whose spiritual inhabitants are on an equally gross plane. Thus these same rocks and this country have all formed in the past the lower spheres of other planets which have now grown too highly developed to attract them, and they will, when this, our Earth, has ceased to attract them, be drawn off and form the spheres of some other planet. So too are our higher spheres formed of matter more etherealized, yet still matter, which has been cast off from the planet spheres much in advance of ours, and in like manner these atoms will be left by us and reabsorbed in turn by our successor. Nothing is lost, nothing wasted, nothing is really new. The things called new are but new combinations of that which exists already, and is, in its nature, eternal. To what ultimate height of development we shall reach, I know not. None can know, since there can be no limit to our knowledge or our progress. But I believe that could we foresee the ultimate destiny of our own small planet, as we can in part judge it from seeing the more advanced ones around us, we should learn to look upon even the longest earthly life and the longest, saddest probation of these dark spheres as but stepping stones on which man shall mount to the thrones of angels at last. What we can see, what we do know and may grasp, is the great and ever-present truth that hope is truly eternal and progression is ever possible even to the lowest and most degraded and sin-stained soul. It is the great truth that we would have each of you to preach both to mortal and immortal man when you return to the earth plains and to your work there, and as you have been helped and strengthened and taught, so do you feel bound by the obligations of gratitude and the ties of universal brotherhood to help others. Let us now bid farewell to this dark land, not in sorrow over its sadness and its sins, but in hope, and with earnest prayer for the future of all who are yet in the bonds of suffering and sin. As our great leader concluded his speech, we took our last look at the dark country, and descending the mountain, we passed once more through the ring of fire, which, as before, was by our willpower driven back on either side of us that we might pass through in safety. Thus ended my wanderings in the kingdoms of hell.